I'm sorry. Welcome to the second of this week's Exponential Race to Zero shows, brought to you by the We Don't Have Time, the Exponential Roadmap Initiative in partnership with UN Race to Zero and We Mean Business Coalition. Today we're going to look at how transportation of people and also of goods can be transformed right here, right now. We'll start by focusing on net zero transport by 2030. And please join me, Johan Falk, co-founder and CEO of Exponential Roadmap Initiative. He will be up on stage shortly. And also we have with us Ingmar, Rentzhog, CEO and founder of We Don't Have Time. Great to have you with us here. Yes.
To get on stage.
Cue to get on stage. Well, lots of people want to join us here. That's fantastic. Hi. So Ingmar, I understand you're doing a number crunching game here today.
Yes, I would like to start this segment by giving a question to the audience. And that is, how likely do you think it is that we're going to reach the emission targets in the Paris Agreement on a scale between 0 to 100%? And try to get this technology to work. So those that think it's 0% that we will reach the emission target in the Paris Agreement, raise your hand. Do we have any pessimists here? We have some pessimists in the room. 25%. A little bit more. And 50%. We have some 50%, 75%. We don't have any 75%, and I presume maybe not 100% either. You're actually a little bit more pessimistic than the audience we had yesterday. We have also asked this question to the viewers on Twitter. Here we have about 57% thinks that it will be very low chances that we reach the emission target, and 11% thinks that we're going to do it. When I ask this question to a lot of people in business community, in investor community, and also on events like this, most people are actually kind of pessimistic. I can understand that, because if we read the news, it's not good news every day. But if we're going to solve this, I think it's very, very important that we believe that it's doable. And what I believe in is that I believe that it's 100%. For me, it's totally clear that we're going to reach the emission targets in the Paris Agreement. And I have some facts to back it up. When we did the first broadcast climate conference from We Don't Have Time 5 years ago, we had 10,000 viewers, where we had people tuning in to watch climate solutions all over the world. When we did this last year, we had 5 million viewers, and when we did it this year on Earth Day, we had 13 million viewers. So the number of people that are engaging in solution and working to solve the climate crisis are increasing more than exponentially. We also have the business community. United Nations have an initiative called Race to Zero, where investors and businesses and cities can join, where they pledge to leave the fossil fuel society behind and go net zero. And today, more than 50% of the global GDP belongs to a business that have pledged to leave the fossil fuel society behind. So we're going to do this. But it's just one important thing, and that is we need to do it on time. Because if we're doing this transition too slow, when we will not solve the climate crisis. So we need to do it on time. And what We Don't Have Time is all about is that we want to speed up change. And we have created a tool for that. So if you download We Don't Have Time app, you could give climate love every time you see someone doing the solutions, doing the right thing. You could give them climate love, and you could share that to others, so more leaders will follow. And when you see someone doing something bad or delaying things, you could give them climate warning, and people don't like to be warned on social media. So this drives change. And we also need the businesses to do the change. And therefore, we are partnering up with the Exponential Roadmap initiative that are helping the businesses not just to pledge it, but also to do it on time on an exponential scale.
Thank you, Ingmar.
So, Johan, we need to know here, why is transport so important and what is happening in the transport sector exponentially?
The transport sector is, the electrical vehicles is already on an exponential trajectory. And, but we also, it's not sufficient. We also need to build all these vehicles with fossil-free material, and we also need to share the vehicles basically through mobility as a service. What we've done in the Exponential Roadmap initiative is that we are bringing together the leading transformers and disruptors, taking action in line with the 1.5 ambition. We basically started with a few companies, and now we have companies representing something like $1,000 billion in revenue, all with the same mission. We need to halve global emissions by 2030 towards net zero. And that is the carbon law. The carbon law we developed with our chairman, Johan about 5 years ago. And that carbon law is actually now implemented as part of the UN Race to Zero. It's part of the European and the US targets. So it also shows that we can scale big ideas fast. It is achievable. But now it's all about action, because we are beyond pledges. And that is the reason why we developed the business playbook, we developed the Exponential Roadmap, the supply chain leaders, and the SME Climate Hub. So these are all examples of exponential climate action. And the Exponential Roadmap states that we have the solutions to halve emissions by 2030 in energy and all the other sectors. And today we'll talk about transportation. So transportation of people, transportation of goods. And how can we reach zero value chains in transportation? Not by 2050, but actually 2030. And why value chains? Well, as a company, you cannot reach zero or net zero on your own. You have to do that through radical collaboration and innovation with your suppliers and with your customers. So we are very excited to have some of these leading companies here today to really talk about how can we go faster in the exponential race to zero. Back to you, Katarina.
Excellent, Johan.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much, Ingmar, for showing us crunching the numbers. It's really, really important what visions we have and how we act together.
We're going to make it, but we need everyone on board, because if you are on the sideline, we're not going to make it. That's simple. We need you all here.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Ingmar. Thank you very much, Johan.
Thank you. Thanks.
We now move on to listen to a keynote from a very well-known person in the field of climate action. And he's with us via Zoom. Nigel Topping was the CEO of We Mean Business until December 2019, where he drove really radical collaboration for climate action. Nigel Topping is today a commissioner on the Energy Transitions Commission and has been instrumental in the launch of many collaborative initiatives, such as science-based targets, Business for Nature, and the Global Commons Alliance. And I hope I have Nigel. Yes, there he is. Wonderful to see you again, Nigel. You have our full attention for your keynote.
Great, thank you. Wonderful to be with you all again. Thank you for all the partners. We Don't Have Time, We Mean Business, and Exponential Roadmap for bringing us all together. And of course, thanks for the glowing introduction. I'm really speaking to you now with my role as one of 2 UN high-level climate action champions, which is a role which was created as part of the Paris Agreement in recognition of the fact that we have to mobilize the whole of society, not just national governments, but businesses, investors, whole value chains, cities, and civil society. So, and this, some of you know me will know that this topic of the exponential transformation in our transport systems is one that's obsessed me for some time. So it's a thrill to be able to join you and share some thoughts on that. And what I want to do is share some perspectives on. As I very much agree that this is already happening, and it's happening exponentially, which means it's going to happen much faster than even many of the forecasters predict. But I also want to lay out many of the reasons why there's a really good case for doing this faster, not just in terms of reducing emissions, but in terms of other arguments, which will be helpful for some of you in businesses or in campaigning organizations or in government. I mean, first thing to say is we know that this is a huge chunk of the problem. Road transport, about 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. But we know that this transition is already taking place. And as I think Johan said, it's largely about e-mobility, but it's also about different models like mobility as a service, and of course about active transport, so more livable, walkable, cyclable cities as well. And it's very, very relevant today because one of the main effects of this transition is to reduce companies' reliance on imported oil, which is volatile in price and geopolitically influenceable, as we're seeing now with the terrible war in Ukraine. I think the transition since Paris in this sector best describes the way that things go exponential, even when people don't expect them. In 2016, after Paris, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, was still saying that we'll be largely buying combustion engines into the 2070s. Then we have this sort of systemic transformation, which involves a disruptor like Tesla, and then some cities like Paris and London starting to ban high-emitting vehicles, and then some countries saying that they'll phase out in 2040. My own country, the UK, said in 2018 that it would phase out combustion engine sales in 2040. And then just 2 years later, as the costs started coming down, Tesla started improving. We had like Mercedes saying there'd be net zero 20 or 100% electric by 2039. All these signals start to coalesce, and the very interesting thing happened in my country. And of course, there's others who are faster than Norway, the Netherlands, but in the UK there was a consultation between government and society, particularly business, that said, we've already said 2040. We now want to think about whether we go 2032 or 2035 within just 2 years. The response to the consultation came out very strongly: do it earlier, do it in 2030. That was business organizations like We Mean Business and the Energy Transitions Commission. It was even an oil company like Shell said, do it earlier because we know it's going to happen. To Ingmar's point, we know this is going to happen, and certainty on it is good for everybody. So, of course, earlier certainty is good for the climate and all of those who are suffering from it, but markets too like that certainty because it de-risks investment. Interestingly now, Bloomberg New Energy Finance are forecasting that 70% of all new car sales will be ZEVs by 2040, but we know it will be wrong because they're wrong because their projection has doubled in the last 5 years. So all these forecasters, whether it's Bloomberg or the IEA, always get it wrong on the low side, even though they know that they still get it wrong on the low side. And they're now talking about trebling of sales in my country, and that we see that trajectory going really, really fast. And of course, I think that the very, very high price of petrol is only going to help accelerate that. So let me, what we really believe is possible is that we can actually see the end of the combustion engine this decade. I mean, I'd be pretty confident by 2035, but it's possible with growing trends even as early as 2029. So let me go through some of the key points that make the case for accelerating this transition. First one I've already mentioned, energy security, right? It's very obvious now how much relying on unreliable and expensive and volatile sources of energy for road transport is not a good idea. Road transport is the single biggest source of oil consumption. The shift to electric vehicles is the single biggest and fastest destroyer of demand for oil. Europe spends $285 million on imported Russian oil every day, 100 billion plus a year. So that's very, very stark at the moment. We also see a huge opportunity for emerging and developing markets by moving quickly to electric vehicles as they develop to save up to $250 billion a year on oil imports by 2030. You think about that as an opportunity to convert that spend, which is not necessary to spend on much needed infrastructure to support renewable generation, electrified transport and climate adaptation. Second reason is jobs, growth. The billions that are now being invested in this ZEV transition are creating jobs, and we know that there will be many, many more jobs actually, surprisingly, in this EV world, given that there will be a reduction of jobs in traditional fuel industries, but all the analysis says there'll be a net job growth. And I think that there's that's through, of course, the massive increase in renewable infrastructure and maintenance in batteries. The Faraday Institute estimates that battery demand is going to increase from 110 gigawatt hours per annum to 6,500. So that's a 60x growth by 2050. Third reason, cost. When the UK's Climate Change Committee looked at the transition from combustion engine to battery power at the level of an economy, they see massive macroeconomic benefits because this is much more efficiency here. So, but also as fleet owners are finding the total cost of ownership is already cheaper for zero emission vehicles, which is why, for example, in the UK, all of our bus companies have bought their last diesel bus already. And of course, for consumers, the sticker price, the upfront cost tends to be more the thing that people look at. But we think within the next 3 to 5 years, across every part of the vehicle range, the purchase price will be cheaper, and of course the savings will be further enhanced. Next point, health. Millions of people are dying prematurely every year because of pulmonary conditions exacerbated by the particulates and the nitrogen oxide that are created by running combustion engines, particularly in cities. So it's another huge benefit. And I think I'll end by saying that in COP26, we saw a real focus on this transition. We saw many countries and many companies lining up to commit to phasing out by 2035. And this was, I think, one of the really important a manifestation of that new dynamic of the COPs to be more about implementation. So yes, negotiation, but the Paris rulebook has been negotiated now. There are some things still to be negotiated. There probably always will be, but the focus is really on public and private driving towards those exponential goals. We know that Glasgow hasn't guaranteed 1.5 degrees, but the international system has agreed to ratchet every year. So one opportunity for everybody here is to look at which countries don't have a combustion engine phase-out date, either cars and or trucks. Because if they don't, then there's an opportunity just to align with the pace of change and say 2030 to 2035 for cars, 2035 to 2040 for trucks, and that will probably bring a lot more ambition into all those NDCs. And what we're really focusing on now with my colleague Mahmoud Mohideen, the Egyptian champion, is how to bring that kind of exponential momentum to Sharm el-Sheikh and have many more countries, many more cities, many more companies, all aligning with that exponential change. The UNFCCC is starting its global stock take. That will be an opportunity for everybody to input to say where there are opportunities for forward-looking policy measures to accelerate that change. And I think that any of you who are interested, I would encourage you to look at the UNFCCC website and look at how you can engage in that process, not just to say how much we're failing by, because we are failing now, but to say how much more confident we can and should be in our ability to go much, much faster. And I think nowhere are we more ready to accelerate the transition than a move from expensive, unhealthy, dirty, polluting, old-fashioned, noisy combustion engines to healthy, cheaper, zero emissions, sexy, cool, more powerful battery powered vehicles. This is going to take the whole of society though. So whatever your role is in this transition, your support is needed to help us reach that point where zero emission vehicles are the obvious choice for everybody, and we can find combustion engines where they belong in the museum. So really, it's a delight to be joining you today, and I'm thrilled with the work of all the partners here in driving that transition. And I look forward to another milestone in Sharm el-Sheikh towards the death of the combustion engine and the birth of a clean energy economy in which everybody all around the world can thrive. Thank you. Let me hand back to the studio.
Well, thank you so much, Nigel, for spelling it out so clearly and also painting out the vision, because we, as Ingmar and Rentzhog said before, we really need to have a vision to aim for. What would you say is the impact for Europe after the decision just came out of Europe to the Commission to ban the oil import? It just finally came through the other day. What effect will this have on this transition and transformation of the transport sector?
Well, it should have I mean, of course, banning imports from one country doesn't mean banning oil imports, so you could keep the same energy structure of the economy and just shift the source. But I think what we all hope it will do is rapidly accelerate the shift towards electrifying transport in Europe for all those reasons I've laid out, and not just search for alternative sources for oil, but to actively reduce the reliance on oil. And as I say, the cities of Europe, the businesses of Europe are ready for that transition. And just one little factoid is I remember when actually I think it was the first incumbent manufacturer to fully commit to going net zero was Mercedes. In 2019, I think the new CEO Ola Källenius committed to the whole company being net zero by 2039. So not just zero emission vehicles, but zero emission materials, as Johan was saying. Less than 2 years later, at the Petersberg Dialogues in Germany, which is a sort of industry ministerial dialogue, Ola said, now that we've been looking at this for 18 months, we're very confident we can be fully electric by 2030, so 10 years earlier. That's very common, right? When people seriously throw engineering and finance intellect at the problem, a couple of years later they realize that they can go much, much faster. So that would be my hope, is that everybody starts to realize that in Europe we can and should, and therefore will commit to going 100% zero emission vehicles by 2030.
Well, thank you. Another factoid, just recently there were reports coming out of Sweden in terms of vehicle sales, and we just broke the barrier of having more EVs sold than any other engines. So it's happening.
It's definitely happening. And that's another good example. No one would have believed that 3 years ago, right? It happens so much faster. That's the power of the exponential function.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for joining us, Nigel.
Thank you.
Our next guest is Charlotte Smith. She's Zero Emissions Children's Health Campaigner, EV, and she will be joining us shortly here. From the age of 11, Charlotte has been campaigning on behalf of all children. And just as Nigel said, the air quality, of course, and also the impact of all of the vehicles is very important. But she's been campaigning all over the world, highlighting the benefits of zero emissions transport by thanking every EV driver that you can find around Great Britain, Oslo, and also in California. And her goal is to take her zero emission campaign message to every country where there is children. So Charlotte, you are with us here. There you are. Wonderful. You have the floor. You have our attention. And please share your presentation.
Thank you. Well, hello, I'm Charlotte Smith. I am the Zero Emission Children's Health Campaigner, and I highlight the benefits that zero emission transport has on children's health with my EV thank you cards, which read, "Thank you for choosing to drive a zero emission all electric vehicle. You're helping children like myself to breathe easier and avoid long-term illnesses, such as stunted lung development, brain illnesses, cancer. Charlotte, age 15. It all started at around age 10 when I was asked by my primary school to write a science paper on changes, and I decided to write mine on the change from ICE, internal combustion engine, to electric. And throughout that process, I not only learned a lot about electric vehicles in general, but also about the benefits that they have on children's health. I then went on to continue, and the only unanswered question from my science paper was when. When would this behavioural change, this pickup, this tipping point to go to electric take place? And this question was finally answered 5 years later when I read a book called Change by Professor Damon Centola, which taught me about tipping points and when behavioural change might happen. For example, behavioural change can be like bumping elbows rather than shaking hands due to COVID, or in our case, moving from combustion engine vehicles to electric. And this taught me that the tipping point is actually when we reach 25% of say someone's network. And this was fantastic news, as the zero-emission all-electric vehicle UK car sales for last year in December was over 26%, suggesting that the UK had already passed the tipping point for electric vehicle adoption. And as you mentioned a little bit earlier, with this knowledge, I hope to take my Children's Health Campaign message to every country where there's children and help to bring their countries to this tipping point.
Wonderful, really. And I've been driving a full electric for 7 years, and I can tell you, whenever I drive in the cities or close to people, especially children, past a school or past a preschool, it feels completely different, because I know that I'm not contributing to their bad health. So there are really big benefits also for the driver, and you're pointing them out and making us feel better, and more people will join, I'm sure. So what is the next step for your campaign? You've been in Great Britain, you've been in Oslo, and so how do you roll out? How do you expand? What do you need to make this happen even faster from your perspective?
The platforms such as today, and also the opportunities to travel, as I said, to other countries and speak on bigger stages. Obviously, this is a massive stage, and I'm super excited and grateful for this opportunity. And really get my voice pushed to bigger audience, so world leaders and people who can really make influence and change happen on behalf of all children.
Wonderful, and I'm sure you will get lots of climate love on the We Don't Have Time platform after this great presentation. And people will share your good example, and you'll be able to expand your network, I'm sure. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you.
Thank you, bye-bye.
And now we move on to the next section here, transport of people, and I hand it over to my dear colleague, Nick Nuttall.
Great, thanks, Katarina. I was just thinking that my brother has an EV in Canada. He has a Tesla with Gulf wings, which I know he bought because he said he was being environmentally friendly, but I think it's because he thought he was very cool with a Gulf wing Tesla. Okay, we're going to kick off this segment, which is Transport of People. Let's hear again from our Exponential Roadmap CEO and co-founder, Johan Falk. Tell us about this section.
Thanks, great. I think it's really important to understand the opportunity of exponential change, as we talked about. We heard some numbers today. How far we reached in terms of new sales of electrical vehicles, which is just outstanding. We are in Sweden today on over 50%, 56% of new sales. In Norway, 85%. And on a global basis, around 8%. And if you look at the forecasts 5 years ago from Bloomberg, they said we will be at 60% 2040. What we said is that basically we will be at 90% on new sales before 2030, and that will happen. I'm absolutely sure. But it's not just about the electrical vehicles. We also need to build them with fossil-free materials, such as steel, which is most important, aluminium, plastics, and so on. And we also need to ensure that we use our vehicles much more efficiently. They shouldn't be parked 95% of the time. We need to share them, right? But also mix it with other type of vehicles, of course, public transportation, biking, and move to mobility as a service. Our focus today here is zero value chains in people transport, not by 2050, but 2030. And we're very excited to have some of the leaders in these areas, H2 Steel in fossil-free steel, Polestar on zero vehicles, and VIA on mobility as a service, all focusing on how can we scale faster. Back to you, Nick.
Yeah, super.
Thanks.
Johan, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. So we're going to have 3 keynotes and then a meaty panel. I say meaty because that's not really very appropriate on a show like this. Maybe a vegan panel, but an interesting panel, I'm sure. And first up is Fredrika, Klarén, who's head of sustainability at the electric car company Polestar, which is on A remarkable and a very fascinating journey. Come and join me. She joined Polestar in April 2020 to drive the company's sustainability ambitions forward on issues such as climate neutrality and circularity. Fredrika, tell us about your moonshot. You have the floor. Over to you, Fredrika.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here. Such a pleasure to be here on this summit discussing these very important topics. And I'm here representing Polestar. We are a young Swedish electric vehicle brand operating from Gothenburg, but with a growing global organization and footprint. And we are all about accelerating the shift into electric and sustainable mobility. We know that as an industry, we have a climate solution today, but we are not fully utilizing it to meet the climate crisis. Even though we hear numbers, the electric car sales is literally going through the roof, we still only have a few % of the global car stock that is represented by electric vehicles. And the climate change really doesn't look to sales number. It looks to what is actually being emitted on the roads today. So we know that as a company, we really have to use our 3 core pillars of design, innovation, and tech to secure that we get an attractive offer out there to really speed up sales even more for us to be able to meet the climate crisis with this powerful tool. And we also want to talk about the fact that as we now transition as an industry into electric mobility, we have to be very honest about the fact that, yes, they are better, and I will soon show you numbers that can show you this, but they are not at all sustainable or perfect. And we really need to put all of our efforts now and move away from focusing on tailpipe emissions to production-related emissions and user-face emissions stemming from charging. We use life cycle assessment at Polestar. It is kind of the beating heart of our climate work. And when we developed Polestar 2, we got to develop a very robust methodology to measure the carbon footprint of the car. And we also were able to collaborate with our affiliate Volvo on this matter, so that we can really also see the difference between a petrol car that was built on the same platform as the electric car. And what we clearly saw was that electric vehicles really offer a route to sustainable, fully climate-neutral mobility in a way that fossil fuel cars can never have. And I wish we didn't have to debate that anymore. Can we say here now that we leave that debate behind and start focusing on this climate solution that we have? And also focusing on getting the emissions stemming from production and use phase down to 0. Like you see in the bars behind me, if you choose an electric vehicle instead of a petrol car and you charge it with renewable energy, you more than half the climate impact of that choice. Halving the climate impact is the magnitude that our actions need to have now. We of course see that batteries, the yellow field in our bars here, represent a specific challenge for us. So at Polestar, we want to use this knowledge that we have. And we now want to take the opportunity to really secure that we see a reduction in climate emissions stemming from the production of electric vehicles this decade, that we can start decoupling the growth of the electric vehicle industry from environmental impacts. And like many companies, we have a net zero target. We want to become climate neutral by 2040, looking at all of our value chains emissions. But we know that it's not enough. We really have to set targets that are more in line with science. So we decided to establish a moonshot goal for ourselves, to create a fully climate neutral car by 2030, and we call it the Polestar Zero project. And this project aims to fully eliminate all of the emissions stemming from the raw material production to when the car rolls out of the factory gate, and also then stemming from when the car ends up at its end of life stage. And this is, of course, a huge challenge, and that's exactly why we're calling it the moonshot goal. We don't know how we will get there. We only know that we must. So we are putting in place now collaborations to research and innovate around 20,000 plus components going into a car on how to exactly produce them in a way that is climate neutral, both when it comes to material, but also functionalities in the car. This is going to be a real car. It's not a concept car. If we only create concept cars, we'll never see true change. We are very happy to already now have onboarded collaborators like SSAB, who does steel, Norsk Hydro, who does aluminium, ZF, for example, SKW and Autoliv. We've also put out a call to action to really open up a channel towards innovators, research institutes, startups, industry peers, other companies from other sectors to really join us now in these collaborative efforts and really take the chance to also, for them, secure that their climate strategies can be realized. And we're not betting on offsetting. That is very important for me to be clear about that. This car will be produced with net zero emissions. We will eliminate the emissions and not rely on efforts like tree planting that doesn't have the impact that it needs this decade. And we also focus, of course, on seeing true change now in our current car projects. And for example, Polestar 2, we are working with iterative improvements all of the time. And for example, we've been able to, compared with a model in 2020, to reduce the carbon footprint with over 1 ton simply by resourcing the smelting part of the aluminium production process and securing renewable energy in that part, since it has such a big share of the emissions. And these are incremental steps that have such a big impact, and we will continue to work with them as well, of course. And last but not least, we will be fully transparent in this journey. Like the numbers you see behind me, we actually put forward to our consumers. And we also published a full life cycle assessment and methodology for anyone to read. We believe that true climate action needs to be coupled with radical transparency. And that is also something that is sorely needed in the automotive industry and throughout other industry. We need to be more brave with sharing the data that we have and the knowledge that we have going forward if we're going to make this happen. Thank you so much.
Yep, thank you very much. It is definitely a moonshot and not a moonshot, which I said earlier. That's really fantastic. Join us for the panel, which is coming up very shortly. Okay, next up is Lina, Håkansdotter of H2 Green Steel, where she is the Vice President and Head of Public Affairs. Yeah, if you want fossil-free cars, you need to build them with fossil-free steel, which is H2 Steel's aim, with a first focus on Europe. And Lina, you have the floor for your keynote. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for this kind invitation. And our name is H2 Green Steel. You might have heard of us, you might not have. We're a real new company, industrial startup. That's not very common species in the world today, but we will see more of us in the coming years, I'm sure. H2 Green Steel's mission is to decarbonize hard-to-abate sectors. That's a difficult sentence. Hard-to-abate sectors, these are those industry sectors that recently have had, or historically have had, hard times getting rid of their fossil emissions. And we try to help them, and we start with steel to produce green steel with almost zero fossil emissions. Sustainability is at the core of our business, and we, as all companies, have some stakeholders in the game. The usual suspects, the investors, the employees, and of course, the most important ones, the customers. But we see that we have two more stakeholders that will judge us, judge our efforts, and also applaud what we're doing. And those stakeholders are the society and the planet. So of course, we are backing, fully aligned with the 1.5 degrees target. And it's our ambition not only to decrease and look upon our own emissions, but to help other sectors. When it comes to our own production, we will of course source fully fossil-free and renewable electricity, get the best raw materials that we can. We will make use of the very efficient process that we are aiming to have with a fully integrated steel production. But we will go further than that. We will help other sectors to decrease their emissions in scope 3. We just heard Fredrika talking about the Polestar emissions, and when you saw her graph, you could see that there was a big chunk still left, the black box. That's the materials going into the car, and steel is a major part of that. So by doing the steel fossil-free, we help the car manufacturers, and of course other customers as well, to decrease their emissions in scope 3. That's a very important part of our business. We already see a great demand. We have a lot of front runners. Polestar is one of them. And we have already secured the sales, the offtake of 1.5 million tons of the steel that we're going to produce. We haven't started our production yet. I will come into that a bit later. But already today, we see that the customers' demand for our product is really high. So we have a lot of front runners, but we need policy to make sure that the ones that are lagging behind also get on the train. So even though we see the front runners are super important for creating the market and putting the demand up and making our investment a possibility, we also see that policy plays a vital role here in setting targets and also putting standards in place. So what are we going to do then? When I told you we're producing green steel, that's our first mission. And we're embarking right now on a journey to start building our factory up in the northern part of Sweden, in a place called Boden. The reason we chose this location is that it has an excellent position when it comes to electricity. In the northern part of Sweden, we have almost 100% renewable electricity in the form of hydropower and wind power. And we also have a great grid access at the site that we have chosen. So right now, we're in the process of getting the environmental permit, and we hope to put the shovel in the ground during summer to start building this magnificent site that we're aiming for. The core of our production will actually be hydrogen. To produce hydrogen, you need a lot of renewable electricity, as I just mentioned. And the hydrogen production that we're going to build will be the world's largest electrolyzer when it comes into operation. From the hydrogen, we will build a tower to directly reduce iron ore and produce green iron. This green iron we will then use in an integrated process to produce the green steel, which is our final product. To do all this in one step, in a continuous integrated process, is highly energy efficient. The processes that are used today use carbon or coal as the reduction agent instead of hydrogen, and that's why it's so heavy fossil emitter. But it also heats and cools and reheats during the process, and that is really energy efficient, not energy efficient. So we will both be using the renewable electricity, but also in a very efficient way. Our target for the phase 1 is to produce 2.5 million tons of green steel, and that we will do by 2025. So as you can hear, we're already almost there. This is not some futuristic project. We are now in the phase of getting our permits, as I said, and the production will start in 2025. So, getting back to the customers, the ones that are buying our products. As I mentioned, we have already offtake for 1.5 million tons of steel. And we see a great interest from the automotive industry. We have companies such as BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Scania on our list. But we also see a great interest from white goods manufacturers, and also a bit surprising to us, construction is a very interested customer side. So I want to conclude by saying that it's not the future, it's already here. We can produce the green materials. We need a customer base, not only the companies buying our products, but the end user wanting to have the totally fossil-free car, not only the one running on electricity, but also using fossil-free materials. We can do it, and we're only starting the journey from H2 Green Steel today.
Great.
Thank you.
Really, really interesting. And as you say, it's only 3 years off.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's another moonshot. We've got a lot of moonshots on this show today. Stay with us, because we're going to have a panel. I'm going to go to the next guest, and then we'll start it. So excellent. Exit the stage for a second, and then I'll call you all back. All right. So last but not least of this trio of speakers on transport of people is Chris Snyder. He's the co-chief operating officer of VIA and the CEO of VIA Europe. At VIA, they're not just into car sharing, they're taking minivan sharing, and we're talking bus sharing, up to new, more passenger-flexible ways of envisioning public transport in cities, but also in rural areas and places underserved or badly served or not served at all with any kind of transportation system. Chris, we're looking forward to your keynote. Yes, here you are on the magic of Zoom. We look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Honored to be with you. I only wish I could be there in person. And before I talk about VIA, I think we should talk about what's at stake. Transportation is now the #1 contributor of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States with a 29% share. And it's risen to the #2 contributor of emissions in the EU. And we as humans have devised ingenious sustainable transport modes, from the bicycle to the scooter to the subway car, but we remain incredibly attached to the private car. Today, 76% of Americans drive their car to work, while only 11% use public transport. In Germany, which has invested significantly in public transport infrastructure, 65% of people still drive to work. And even in the Netherlands, where biking is a way of life, 56% of people choose to commute by car. At the same time, transportation is a historical source of inequity and injustice. In the US, 45% of Americans have no access to public transport. And at the same time, owning a personal vehicle is the second highest household expense. So we know that efficient, affordable, sustainable public transportation creates access to jobs and educational opportunities and connects communities. But traditional public transport infrastructure is also hugely expensive. So in far too many cities, our investments in public transport haven't kept pace with urbanization. The result is that increasing numbers of people aren't able to live within a reasonable commute jobs. This creates a kind of mobility poverty that erects barriers to economic opportunity. In fact, studies have shown that transportation is the single biggest barrier to escaping poverty. Okay, so what are the stakes? To avoid the worst impacts of climate change, as well as to create more just and equitable communities, we need to fundamentally change how we humans move, which means radically reimagining our relationship with the private car. The good news is that we have the most important solutions today. They already exist. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but we do have to rethink the bus. At least that's how we feel at VIA. We envision a future where efficient, affordable, sustainable transport is available to all, and we believe that technology has a huge role to play in expanding the reach and impact of public transport systems. As a transit tech company, VIA builds innovative software to enable our customers, who are cities, transit agencies, school districts, among others, to transform their legacy transport systems, which, let's not forget, are based on 17th century technology, into advanced digital networks that run on data. technology-enabled public transport uses algorithms and mobile apps to create more dynamic and resilient services, which can be launched in weeks and then adapted and expanded as the needs of communities evolve. In practice, that can mean creating demand-responsive buses, which rural riders can hail with an app, or providing tools to help cities plan more efficient transport networks and redesign streets for shared use mobility, or enabling efficient first and last mile connections from suburban transit deserts to existing high-frequency rail or bus services. And what we found, having deployed our software in over 500 cities in 34 countries around the world, is that this approach works to reduce reliance on private cars and shift people to more sustainable modes. For instance, we partner with Transport for Wales to launch a service called Flexi, which is a nationwide demand-responsive bus system that provides flexible transport options for residents of 11 rural, suburban, and urban communities. And when riders were surveyed, 73% said that they had been able to reduce their private car usage thanks to the service. And 9% reported that before using Flexi, they had never taken a bus before. We're also partnering with Jersey City in the United States, which has 17,000 households, a significant portion below the poverty line. And we launched a service with them aimed at providing underserved communities with an effective first and last mile connection to transit hubs in the downtown area. Now, this service launched right at the beginning of the pandemic, and not only was this one of the few public transport services in the entire country that actually grew during the first stages of the COVID pandemic, 41% of the riders of that service say that they have been able to use the service as a direct replacement for their private car. I could tell you about a list of similar projects that are hundreds long and include some of the most important public transport players globally, whether that's the BBG in Berlin or TfL in London, cities like Seattle, or European regions like Flanders. I think the question is, why do these services matter right now? I think number one, traditional public transport, buses, trains, is often the wrong tool, especially in suburban and rural contexts. A bus that comes twice a day is simply not providing adequate mobility, nor is it competitive with a private car. On-demand modes can provide much higher levels of service for the same cost. Number two, we just don't have time. Legacy transport systems, trains and buses, take years, if not decades, and billions of euros to realize. Digital systems can be launched in a matter of weeks and can complement more rigid investments like subways. And over the last decade, number three, we've paid far too much attention to electrifying or automating single occupancy vehicles, and not nearly enough to encouraging modal shift towards sustainable modes, which is something we know can have an impact right now on our carbon emissions. So obviously, if the question is, how can we radically rethink our relationship to the private car, then we do need to take an all-of-the-above approach, which includes bikes, trains, buses, scooters, EVs, and on-demand shuttles. What Fredrika and the Polestar team are working on has immense promise. EVs, but simply electrifying every single occupancy vehicle in the world wouldn't be enough. For one thing, we don't have enough time to do it. It will take decades to electrify every vehicle. And for another, our energy grid is obviously not 100% renewable, nor is it anywhere close to that. Building cars, EVs in particular, takes a significant amount of production energy. And EVs take about 2 times that of internal combustion engine cars today. Obviously, that will improve. But if we're trying to make progress today, we need to take an all-of-the-above approach. Crucially, even if we could magically transform every vehicle into an EV today, there would still be far too many cars on the streets. So we have an enormous opportunity to reimagine our communities and the ways people get around them. And cities and governments, in particular, have a fundamental role to play in this process. They set the vision, they plan, and they can fund new projects. Companies like Via also have a role to play because while increasingly cities are offering bold visions for achieving carbon neutrality, they don't always have the technological tools to implement that vision on their own. So there's a real opportunity to establish public-private partnerships that are durable and aligned to the long-term goals of building more livable cities, while also moving rapidly towards the adoption of far more sustainable transport solutions. Reflecting on the last 2 years, there was a moment or two in the summer of 2020 where a remarkable side effect of the pandemic revealed itself in cities all over the world, and that was streets devoid of cars. Bicycle highways, superhighways were springing up. Streets were giving over to pedestrians and curbside restaurants. This is obviously not a state that could or should last forever, and obviously there were terrible side effects of that situation as well, but it offered a glimpse into a fairly tantalizing future, I think, a future in which cities could thrive without polluted air, without congestion, without the private car. The question is, what are we going to do about it now? And at VIA, we believe that bringing tech-enabled public transport to as many cities as possible, as quickly as possible, is one of the key things that we can do to reduce our carbon footprint and increase the livability of our cities. Looking forward to discussing with everyone else.
Super. Well, thanks, Chris. That was very exciting. And just one quick question, because we just have a couple of seconds, is when it comes to VIA, a lot of people maybe don't know VIA, because I think a lot of you people you're working with in these cities and things like that have their own names for their public transport systems, don't they? They have names all over. You just mentioned one in Wales, I think, Flex, yeah? So
there's Flexi in Wales. Yeah, there's Sprinty in Hanover. There's the Berlkönig in Berlin. There are all sorts of names. And we are, in a way, in the background, helping to power these systems using our technology.
Yeah, okay. Just clearing that one up. Okay, we're going to have a panel. Could the two amazing speakers that were with us before join us physically here? We've got this very delicious black sofa, which you may wish to sit on. There's just two of you. I mean, Chris is virtual, so why don't you join us on the sofa here? And thanks very much. Chris, you can see us? You can see who we are and stuff like that?
I can see you great. I don't have a sofa, which is too bad, but I'll do my best.
Well, don't worry. You're actually in Stockholm, even though you don't know it, because we've actually got an amazing backdrop there, so that's super. Okay, so maybe an overarching question to you all that focuses on the opportunities and overcoming the challenges to speed up even faster the race to zero, the UN race to zero, where we're all supposed to be halving emissions by 2030 and hitting net zero sometime well before 2050. I think this is the idea of radical collaboration. I mean, it sounds fantastic, but what is it? And why is it different to how we've done business before? And maybe, Fredrika, I could put that to you, or maybe you'd like to pick that one up, or Chris, who would like to? What is this thing, radical collaboration? Because we keep hearing about it on these shows. Why is it different to what we did before? Yeah.
I could start. I think the value chains are really important, and we work very close to our customers and also to our suppliers in ensuring that we move forward as fast as possible. So I think that's collaboration, and the value chain perspective is key to making this happen at the speed that we need.
Right.
And I mean, the word radical gets thrown around a lot, but it is indeed radical, because industries, companies traditionally are not used to collaborating like this. They are afraid of competition laws. They are afraid of losing IP rights, patents, and so on. That's how we've built our industries. So taking the first step towards a collaboration feels very risky as a company, I think, still. So the idea in itself is a bit radical when you look at the company culture that is prevalent. But it is what we need. And we also see that when we do it, when we finally do it and collaborate, it has an amazing value, not only on an environmental or social level, but also bringing value, monetary value to companies. And that is what I think that more and more companies are realizing, which is good.
Chris,
if I can add just one quick note on from my perspective, I totally agree with Lina and Fredrika have said, but we sell software. That's how our business works. But we refer to all of our partners, most of which are in the public sector, as partners, not customers, not clients. And that's because we see the relationship that we're building as essentially co-creating a new mode of transport. And that's something that cities can't do by themselves, and we can't do on our own either. And so it's this, really we in the best cases, we are tied at the hip, and we are, really pursuing almost identical goals. And I think that's a pretty radical departure from, selling other kinds of software, whether it's, word processing software or something else to the public sector. It's a really different vision for how that public-private partnership could work.
Did you want to come back on that, Fredrika, or you were just looking at me for a second? Maybe not.
I was just looking at you with interest on what the next question would be.
But it is interesting, Chris, because, just thinking about this, working with competitors, in a sense, is interesting for you, and also for cities, right? For them, the word radical must actually spring to mind for cities, because they're normally, quite conservative. There are some radical people within cities that want to do radical things, but generally a city is considered, a political system that is generally conservative in its behavior. So I think radical collaboration might work very nicely in cities too.
But could I just touch upon that, the competition piece? Because when we're into this business that we're into, decarbonizing all the hard-to-abate sectors globally, even though we have really high ambitions in H2 Green Steel, we won't be able to do that all over the globe. So we really aim to be lighthouse for others to follow. And we don't see, you mentioned SSAB, there is another fossil-free steel project up in the northern part of Sweden. We don't see them as competitors. We see them as we need so much green steel on the market, and we can work faster if we move together. And actually, since we launched our project, the hybrid project have increased their speed, like 10 years.
So maybe the competition comes later when you're all generating, billions and billions of tons of fossil-free steel. It'll happen later, but right now there's the
But the market is gigantic.
Let's move on a second. I wanted to come to Fredrika here a little bit. On this zero plan for Polestar, you mentioned that you don't quite know how you're going to do it, but you're kind of moving down that road. So would you say you're on track to develop the world's first circular electric passenger car? And as you go through this process, where do you see the blocks on this? What are the things that are surprising you? I didn't know that, or is it all very predictable? So,
it's not at all predictable. We are learning new things every day. We are on track when it comes to our own time plans. We have a time plan for how to utilize these 8 years that are left. We will have a research and innovation phase. We will have a phase of advanced engineering and working with the architecture. And then the last 3 years will be your average car product development phase. We absolutely don't know how to, for example, reduce or eliminate the direct emissions stemming from the aluminium production, for example. There's chemistry in this. It's not simply just using renewable energy in the supply chains that will cut it. It's actually also eliminating direct emissions from processes that goes into producing materials. So we are teaming up with very knowledgeable people from business, but also from research on this. It will be needed that we have cross-sector collaboration to solve these problems.
Right. Lina, I wanted to ask you one thing, I just was reading something the other day, which is that China currently produces more than half of the world's steel and accounts for around 60% of carbon dioxide from steel emissions. That's huge, right? I don't know how much Sweden produces, but are you hoping that if you get this right, you could license this to the really big economies that are producing the huge emissions linked with steel? Is this the dream?
Yeah. It's like I said, we want to be a lighthouse for others to follow. And actually, the technology that we are using, the electrolyzers, the direct reduction of iron, and then the steel mill, that is a mini mill concept, all these three pieces are already existing today, but they are not put together. And the direct reduction is using natural gas, not only hydrogen, as we are going to do. So we already have the pieces. Now we have to show that they work together. And then others will follow. And as I said, I mean, it's not only about us. Our purpose is to actually decarbonize globally. And we can't be the only ones doing that. So to serve as a lighthouse, to show that it's possible and to create a market, that's what's needed to make it in time. And we don't have so much time.
I'm just trying to draw the thread a little bit here for the audience. So you could also be making fossil-free steel for buses, because Chris has been talking quite a lot about buses.
Of course.
Which gives me a segue to ask Chris a question.
Good.
All right, good. So, Chris, my question to you, when I talked to you last time, you were mentioning, I think you alluded to this in your opening remarks, you just bought another software company, is that right, that allows you to model streets.
That's right. It's the company's called Remix.
Yeah, what would that mean? So say I was a city leader tomorrow and you popped into my office. I went, what are we going to do about this mess here with all the buses going in the wrong direction and serving nobody? How do you share the streets? I think you talk about sharing the street a bit with this software.
Yeah. So it's a great question. There's a couple components of the software. One part allows transport planners to use data, layers of data, whether that's demographic, socioeconomic, distance from existing transport stops, to really understand where fixed route networks make sense, where perhaps they don't from an economic perspective, and where on-demand networks make more sense, and to make better decisions about how transport as a system should work in a particular city. And that's a process that used to take so much effort and using pen and paper that it only happened every 20, 30, 40 years, which is why transport can get so outdated so quickly. But if you could do it digitally and make it collaborative, that could happen very rapidly. And there's also a module that allows planners to redesign street infrastructure to allow for bus lanes or for cycle lanes. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine that put together, this process of planning really becomes a process of reimagining what a city could be and how it could look like. That a bunch of many cities all over the world are engaging in this process. And we're trying to bring tools to market that will help ideate what the city should look like and then actually implement and execute against that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. We're really running out of time here, which is terrible because I'm really enjoying this conversation. I've got so many damn questions here, even about your factory that you're building with this amazing design that blends into the landscape in Sweden, which was just cool. I wanted to know. But finally and briefly, to each one of you, what's your call to action for COP27 in Egypt, the next UN climate conference in Sharm el-Sheikh? It's going to have to be brief. So I'm going to go, Lina?
I can be super brief. It's time to move away from the pledges and get to action, near-time action.
Okay. Fredrika?
We have to secure a just transition within this decade on renewable energy. If we don't solve that, everything is risked. So
right, we need a massive ramping up of renewable energy and jobs for the workers that are going to be leaving the fossil fuel industry. Some security, Chris?
Set ambitious goals for moving people out of private cars and into shared modes of transport, and then create the programs, the funding programs, the innovation programs that will allow cities to innovate and experiment and make it happen.
Okay. Good. Thank you very much indeed. I've enjoyed this conversation. It could have gone for hours because it's really, really fascinating, but we don't have hours. We don't have time. Thank you very much. Arrivederci, Chris, from New York, I think, where you are, and to our two wonderful guests here in the studios. Thanks.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Right. We're moving to our next section, which is transport of goods. And I'm going to ask Johan Falk of the Exponential Roadmap Initiative to join us again on stage to give us a framing of this theme. Come on down, Johan. It's like a game show, isn't it?
Right, Nick.
Okay.
Thank you. Great to be back again.
Great to be back again, yeah.
Yes, that's right. So now we talked about transport of people. We will talk about transport of goods. And I start with the sort of demand side, because as we heard before, through Race to Zero and these initiatives, we have almost half of the economy actually committed to net zero. And basically, that we need to halve emissions by 2030 and do that through the complete value chain. So companies have committed to halve their emissions through their value chain, which actually includes transportation of goods, which is a large part of that, what we call Scope 3. So there is a great opportunity now that companies need low fossil transportation of goods just to be able to enable their targets. The same for cities. Cities have been setting net zero targets. They also need close to zero solutions for transportations to achieve their targets. Okay, the good news is that we do have solutions which can actually cut 50 to 90% of the emissions. Not tomorrow, but actually in the near term and around the corner. So it will be absolutely essential to connect demand and supply and to remove the blockers. We can only do that in collaboration through the value chain. We talked about that before. So we have these 4 leading companies, which we're really proud of and working together with, actually working together to show that it is achievable, it can be done, and also what are the blockers that we need to remove to accelerate move to zero good transportation. Back to you, Nick.
Super. All right.
Thanks.
So let me introduce our next guest. We've got Evalena Falk, who's Director of Strategic Account Management at Scania. Hello, come on down. We've got Martin Andersen, the Global Head of ESG, Environment and Social Governance and Quality at Scan Global Logistics. Massimo De Alexandro, Director of Sustainability and Innovation at Havi. And last but not least, Jimmi Paulsen, who's Global Transport Manager at Alfa Laval. Good. Welcome, everybody. It's quite a big stage, this, actually, but suddenly it's got very small. Thank you very much for all being here. I think we're going to invite you, Evalena, to make the first remarks to get going.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, Martin, it's great to be here together and to share what we have been working on together over the last year when it comes to decarbonization of road transports.
Yes, really great to stand here together finally to present some of the reduction possibilities within especially road transportation, which is also a part of all other transportation modes like ocean, air and rail.
Perhaps we should start by explaining why we are hosting this session together. I mean, you are representing a freight forwarding company and I represent a truck manufacturer. Normally, we would not be talking to each other at all. But your carriers and hauliers, they would typically be talking to our local subsidiaries to buy trucks. But 1 year ago, you contacted me directly. Why?
Yeah, that's right. I contacted you because we were wondering how should we start our reduction journey together with all the customers. And we thought we have to start at the beginning with the emitting trucks. So I came directly to Scania. As a logistic provider, we see ourselves as we need to take a coordinating role in the center of the supply chain to work with all stakeholders to try and create some solutions that can offer low or net zero solutions to our customers and especially create a demand for them. The customers are coming to us and demand reductions now. Not only because they want to stop climate change, but also to gain a competitive advantage in the climate transition in their sector and to avoid the CO2 tax coming. So this is also good business for them, and that's important. So we couldn't do this alone. We need to go into partnerships, and Scania is a very strong brand and have a strong commitment to sustainability. So this is why we actually came to you. great match.
Yeah, it is. And it's been a great experience to work together across the last year to explore opportunities across the value chain. And in doing that, we have a lot of learnings that we would like to share with you today. And we have two great showcases that we are intending to explain. But before we do that, Martin, why don't you explain a little bit how you at Scania Global Logistics work with the decarbonization of transports?
Certainly. Well, we are a freight forwarder, and as a freight forwarder, it's also our responsibility to take care of the customers. We share the same emissions in Scope 3 from transportation, and we are committed to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees, but also to reduce our emissions with 50% before 2030 and reach net zero in 2050. So this is key for us. But starting with the purpose of the company, we exist to make the world a little less complicated. And why is this important? Well, the world is getting more and more complex. We see border restrictions. There's a lot of things going on. So it's not a standard service anymore. You really need to create the right solutions to the customers. So that is our purpose, to decarbonize the world of logistics, but also decarbonize our customers' journey towards net zero transportation. It's critical that we start reducing, because the emissions within the logistic and transportation industry is keep growing all the time. So we own 14% of the global emissions. So that's a big responsibility. And transportation and logistics is the fastest growing source of emissions. So we need to be more sustainable in this industry. However, we have solutions that can decarbonize transportation with up to 50 to 90% of the emissions. I want to present how we need to have a baseline for CO2 transparency. I want to talk about how transportation modes and setup can help us decarbonize the whole supply chain. And I'll also touch upon the fuel types that can really help us in this journey. When we look at the CO2 baseline, we have already today full transparency available to show the CO2 on all transportation modes, air, ocean, rail, road, down to each trade lane, down to the pickup and the distribution. And this is open source. Everybody can do it. It's a standard in the industry. And we calculate the CO2 at the highest international standard, meeting the requirements from the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So this is important to have a complete transparency on your CO2 emissions. Next to this, we want to show that if we compare the different transportation modes, CO2-wise, then we will see that the air freight transportation is the most emitting transport mode. But if you go from an air solution to an air-ocean solution, you will save 49% of the CO2. An air-ocean solution could be ocean out of China into Dubai and flying it from Dubai into Europe. That will be an air-ocean solution. But if you go from an air-ocean solution to a road solution, then you will save 89% of the CO2. And from road to rail, 51%, and from rail to ocean, 53%. And most important, if you go directly from air freight to an ocean freight solution, you will save 98% of the emissions. So now we know that air freight is the highest emitter, but we also know that combined with all the cargo in the world, then ocean is still the highest emitting transportation mode, because the the volume of goods going on ocean freight will exceed all other transportation modes. But if a company has a business model or need time-sensitive products and need to stay in air freight, then we have solutions also to help these customers. So if we look at air freight, we have sustainable aviation fuel, which is a drop-in blend for the jet fuel, and it will reduce up to 80% of the emissions from air freight. So that's a good opportunity right now as a transition fuel. We also talk about electric trucks, which can reduce up to 99% if we use renewable energy. But also here we have both biofuel and biogas to help us in the transition. And for ocean freight, there's also biofuel available to reduce the emissions up to 80%. And this is transition fuels, and this is while we are waiting for the hydrogen-based fuels, which will reduce the CO2 emissions very close to 100% within all transportation modes. But it will still take us around 5 to 10 years to have these fuels available in the volumes that we need. So there are significant opportunities already now to reduce our emissions. It's possible, we know the goals and we have the tools. So what does it take to get us there? This we will discuss at the end of this session in the panel discussion.
Thank you, Martin. I think what you have done in terms of creating that baseline calculation and using a scientific approach to have a starting point for the rest of the work that needs to be done is really, really excellent. So let me try and explain what is possible to do when it comes to road transports. At Scania, we build our sustainability around 3 pillars of sustainable transports. First of all, I should introduce our company to you a little bit. Our purpose is to drive the shift to a more sustainable transport system. We do that in collaboration with our partners and customers, and I think today's sessions here is a very good illustration of how we do that. Coming back to our 3 pillars for sustainable transports. We have energy efficiency, we work with renewable fuel and electrification, and finally, we also work with smart and safe transports. So, energy efficiency. This is about our engineering team working relentlessly to always come up with the most efficient solution for all of our engines. Renewable fuel and electrification. Well, here we are trying to create solutions for all different types of operations in all parts of the world to decarbonize transport. And I'll come back to this in a second. And then smart and safe transport. This is about digitalization. Today we have more than 500,000 trucks around the world where we can use the data of these vehicles, the operational data, to ensure that we can optimize the specification of the vehicle, that we can support driver behavior, and that we can use work with the fill rates to ensure operational efficiency. So let's dig a little bit deeper into what is possible to do here and now when it comes to renewable fuel and electrification. So the numbers you see on this slide is well-to-wheel calculations and intended then to share the operational efficiency of each of these solutions and the CO2 reductions that are possible. The gas vehicles are an excellent opportunity. And here we are really encouraged now to see the progress when it comes to renewable gas availability, and especially in Europe, in North Europe, in Netherlands and Germany, but also in Brazil. The biomethane is now getting possible to drive on, and I think this is an excellent way to reduce CO2. We also work, of course, with hydrated vegetable oil and biodiesel, but here we are relying a lot on the infrastructure availability as well. Electrical trucks will be a big important step into the future. But what you can see on this slide is that we still have a challenge when it comes to availability of green energy. If we look at the European net today, the possibility we have is to reduce by 55% because of the limitations of availability of green energy in the grid. So it's important where we implement these kind of solutions when it comes to e-mobility today. So, at Scania, we are using all of these different measures towards our targets towards 2025. We were actually the first truck manufacturer to sign up for science-based targets, and 96% of our emissions are coming from the vehicles that we put on the road. So our target is to reduce all of the CO2 from those scope 3 emissions by 20%. And you can see the scaling of how we intend to do that. Working with, first of all, with the conventional powertrain. We recently launched an upgraded new powertrain that can deliver 8% fuel savings versus the previous one, which is already efficient. And this will be still important in many parts of the world for the coming years. On top of that, we have the work we do then with the data and working with the optimization of specifications and the driver behavior. We have the collaborations on working together with biomethane and other collaborations on biogas. And then, of course, the big step forward will be in terms of electrification. So let me finish off by sharing our journey and our roadmap when it comes to electrification. Already today, Scania, we are doing city distribution and also some regional haulage with the first generation of electrical vehicles and also plug-in hybrids. But we know that this is also the most efficient way to use the energy in terms of heavy trucks going forward. And we see a tremendous growth of the availability and the growth of the roadmap going forward in terms of solutions. So over the coming years, we will see many new applications coming, and the big game changer for our industry will be the possibility to do long haulage transports also on electric vehicles. So what you see is that in the coming years, we will have a truck that will be able to do 4.5 hours of driving with 45 minutes of charging. And this is, of course, adjusted to the European regulations, where a truck driver anyhow has to stop for a break for 45 minutes after he has done 4.5 hours of driving. So this will open up completely new opportunities. And in combination with this, we also expect that the total cost of ownership will actually come down to a level or even go below the level of the diesel cost of ownership. So combining these different, the technological possibility and also the business case that will be improving, this explains the very steep growth curve of electrical solutions within our portfolio over the coming years. So technology will be there and the business case will be there as well. But the big challenge for us will be infrastructure. Today, the first customers that are operating electrical trucks, they are using their own depot charging. They are investing in their own infrastructure. But for long haulage to be possible, then we will need to rely also on public infrastructure. So, a lot of opportunities ahead, but also some challenges when it comes to infrastructure. Back to you, Martin.
Yeah. Great stuff. And very encouraging to learn that these solutions can actually be used all over the world, in all parts and regions. So, super important. To illustrate, I want to present the next case, which we have done together with our customer Alfa Laval, who is also a company who are highly committed to sustainability. So, welcome, Jimmi Paulsen.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Jimmi Paulsen. I come from Alfa Laval. Alfa Laval is a leading provider of first-class products within separation, fluid handling, and heat transfer. We strive to accelerate success, you can say, for our customer, people, and also the planet, at least. And in our strategy going forward, we have committed to be carbon neutral by 2030. And we strive, of course, to succeed there through our prioritize to decarbonize and innovate and our partnerships. If we look at our scope, then we have an ambition goal to reduce, you can say, 50% of our emission by 2023, based on 2020 numbers. We, of course, expect to reach that target. And we talk about scope 1 and 2. It's what directly impact Alfa Laval in production. When we look at scope 3, it's everything that goes in indirectly, like And that, of course, means that we have a clear scope for the future, and we are on the right path when it comes to that. When you look at transportation, as Martin said before, air freight represent the majority of our emission, and on our outbound side, air freight represent 80%. And that's, of course, easy to look at, and we, of course, strive to use sea freight more than we do today. But everything counts. When we then look at the key contribution factors, it's of course important, as said today, that we strive to move to alternative fuel sources and away from fossils, and switch to renewable electricity. And you can say that's why Alfa Laval is here today, to be part of this positive initiative and part of this team presenting today.
Yeah, thank you, Jimmy. If we look at the case that we did together, then we started out by analyzing how we could go from the factory in Lund in Sweden via Staffanstorp, another factory, and then to Denmark to drive this with the electric truck. And what we learned is that this is very possible. It's a road for 60 kilometers each way, so in total 120 kilometers, and this was no problem with the trucks that Scania provides. And I think it's quite impressive that we have an operational range of 350 kilometers, and we can carry more than 40 tons. So we are also talking the most heavy unit in transportation, which is the 40-foot container, and we can take it 350 kilometers. So the solutions are very much available. We saw that if we use the overnight wall charger at the depot, then we will be ready every day to do this trip, but also able to service more customers if we have the fast charger put in place. And that's where the renewable energy at the location in Alfa Laval could be a good opportunity to use the renewable energy for the fast charging at their location. And if they have a break, the driver, which Scania talked about, of 45 minutes, then we can actually gain 170 kilometers extra. So this is a quite good case. If we look at the total cost of operation, well, we could see that it will increase with around 14%, but that is with subsidies from the government. Without subsidies, we will have a 22% increase of the total cost of operation. Looking at the CO2, we can see that versus conventional truck using electric truck, we can reduce with 58% of the CO2 if we use the current energy mix in the grid that we have today, with the renewable energy that's in the grid that we get out today. But if we can use completely renewable energy, then we will be close to 100% reduction of the CO2. So there are good possibilities there.
Well, thank you, Martin and Jimmy. I think this is a great example of how we can work together across the value chain to achieve what we would like to in terms of sustainable transport. Now, here we could see a gap in the TCO analysis between the diesel solution and the electrical solution. Now we have the commitment of all the parties involved in this discussion to fill that gap, because we need to have those first examples and first experiences of having those electric trucks on the road, so that we can start working on the scaling of e-mobility within Alfa Laval's transports for the future. So that's our first case. Our second case is together with a partner that we at Scania have been working on for a long time across the value chain. It is actually a customer that was the first one to challenge us to come up with a sustainability roadmap, and to also ask them to tell us how can we find a CO2 solution, and also look at the total cost of ownership to enable this kind of transition. So for me, it's a very big pleasure to welcome Massimo D'Alessandro from Havi.
Thank you, Evalena. So good morning and good afternoon also from my side to everybody. Let me start explaining who is Havi. Havi is a multinational company that is managing the supply chain for leading brands. Our biggest customer is McDonald's, so you understand that we operate in this type of business, transporting food, packaging at multi-temperature. We work on sustainability since many years, so it is now more than a decade. So we have dedicated a big effort to this area. And one of the first learning since the beginning was that it was important to properly measure the improvement done on sustainability, starting from the concept that you cannot improve what you are not able to measure. And also another important concept that was clear since the beginning is that the sustainability area is an area where you cannot work alone. And so the concept of partnership, and we will talk again during my presentation, and also the previous colleagues, they spoke about it, is very important. Because if you work alone, the results that you can achieve are limited, but instead, if you engage properly customer and supplier, of course, the results are exponential. In this slide, there are some examples of awards that we got during this journey of more than 10 years, especially from McDonald's, you see. And these awards normally are given from them to the supplier that is more active and achieving the highest level of results to contribute to their, let's say, Scope 3 target. We have been also, like Scania, one of the first in the logistics sector to commit to SBTi. In 2019, we started with our official target to reduce within 2030 our intensity emission. Intensity emission, I mean the kilogram of CO2 per tons that we deliver. This is the way we measure, by 40% within 2030. Now we are already rising the bar because we want to also commit for the net zero in 2050. We are already in this process, and of course this process will increase the previous target of reduction of 40%, and our expectation is that in the near term, in 2030, this 40% will be increased to more than 50%. The concept of partnership, I spoke already about it before. This was already clear since the beginning, and this is the reason why, together with Scania, together with McDonald's, we have established a partnership in order to do projects together, to implement technologies, to implement a way of working, to make programs. You will see later there are examples of programs that we have implemented. And with Scania, specifically in 2016, we have also signed a single vendor agreement. So our Scania is our official supplier for trucks. And thanks to this, we have aligned our target in order to boost the implementation of all these, let's say, panel of technologies and projects that we have tested and implemented up to now. Some examples. So between the several projects that we have done during this journey, I wanted to put the attention on this one. We started in 2016 with a program that we have called Alternative Fuel Roadmap. And the target of this program was to convert all our entire European fleet from diesel to alternative fuel. When I say alternative fuel, is all the other type of fuel, meaning gas, natural fuel, electric, hybrid, and also hydrogen that today we have in our panel of trucks. But then this program has achieved great results, but we saw also during this journey that the environment was changing, and especially the big cities. So we know we are in Stockholm now. Stockholm is one of the examples. And many cities are increasing the restriction, meaning city center are closed to combustion engine. And this is the reason why we wanted to create a new program that will support the first one. This new program has been called Zero Emission Roadmap, and it's quite clear. What does it mean? Meaning that especially for big cities, we want to anticipate what is going to come, analyzing and studying the way to convert the classical combustion fleet to fleet with zero emission. This was not only a study or an idea, because we have already tested this program, and the first market where we have established it was Spain. And it is also a way to create a positive competition between the market, because competition also in sustainability is something that creates a positive environment. But coming back to Spain, of course, the parameter that has been taken into consideration to make this analysis has been, of course, first of all, we need to be honest, in this moment, the new technologies are more expensive. So when we speak about battery electric, when we speak about hydrogen, we know that the price of this truck are much higher compared to the diesel. So without local subsidies today is very difficult. But then there are other parameters that can be taken into consideration, like, for example, the higher flexibility that zero-emission truck can get when they go into the city center. Because normally in many cities they create restriction in terms of time, in terms of zone, to high-emitting trucks. And when you go with battery electric or when you go with hydrogen, of course, the flexibility increase. Higher flexibility means higher utilization of the truck. And higher utilization of the truck together with the subsidies means that you can also take under control the total cost of ownership. On the right of this slide, you see that in Spain, this analysis has shown that it is possible. It is possible. We have identified two milestones in 2025 and in 2030. And of course, our initial fleet in Madrid, now we are talking here, the example is for Madrid, our totally combustion fleet, diesel plus gas truck, will be gradually converted to zero-emission trucks. But what is important is that this is not only an idea, because you see in the slide 2025 or 2030, it is already happening now, because again, thanks to the subsidies, we have been able already to put on the street electric truck in Madrid and hybrid trucks. So this is already starting. As Martin said before, it is possible already now. Of course, we need to find the proper environment and the proper way to make it happen. These are the results. So I said that this zero-emission roadmap, the final target is to reduce as much as possible the emissions, the CO2, at the same time to keep under control the total cost of ownership. And you see that both in 2025, arriving to 2030, the emissions are pretty close to zero. But at the same time, what is important is that also the total cost of ownership is kept under control. And we expect also, with the evolution of the technology, to have a little bit of savings using this type of technology. It's not only Spain what we are doing. Here there is a map of Europe where you can see linking the type of color to the type of truck. We have already battery electric, we have already plug-in, we have already hydrogen truck that are already in the street. And we are doing this where also economically is feasible. In addition to this, of course, it is always important to keep in mind that the biggest part of the trucks that are running across the world, also in Europe, are diesel. So the presence and the availability of biofuel especially now, is still very, very important.
Thank you, Massimo. I think it's extremely encouraging to see that already today we have a concrete case where we can calculate a parity on the electrical case versus the diesel technology. And this is important because we are going to need that if we're going to scale up the electric solutions for the future. So, to summarize in a few words, we wanted to share in this session that it is possible to drive the shift to sustainable solutions already with today's technology and today's solutions. But that we need to collaborate in new ways across the value chain to make it happen. If we work together and we take all the different parts of the value chain and put them around the table and we apply a little bit of creativity and a little bit of open-mindedness, then we can find solutions to the roadblocks that we are sure that we are going to encounter. So, we are all determined here to make it happen in the coming years, and our hope is that we have inspired some of you to also join our collaborative approach for the future. Thank you.
Super. Right, we're going to have a panel, and I've made the executive decision we're going to sit down, because you've all been standing up for so long. Let's go over here. We can probably get 2 on the sofa. I'll take the chair here as the moderator, and 1 on the easy chair. Actually, there are 3, so that's 3 on the sofa. That's really quite something, isn't it? Oh, there's one of those little copper things. It looks like a milk churn. Well, well done for that. You know, actually, I learned something, which the penny dropped when I was watching this. And the penny that dropped was, when you think about the Science Based Targets Initiative, where you have to reduce your Scope 1, your Scope 2, and your Scope 3 emissions, and people talk, yeah, the value change, you have to decarbonize those and things. You suddenly realize that, of course, you're all connected in a chain. Right? And you're not going to be able to reduce your emissions unless Scania does something, and you're not be able to do what you want unless they do this, and you're not. So suddenly you realize that actually you're all pushing each other if you're going to meet your science-based target. And then, of course, collectively, you need to push the governments as well on certain things like charging infrastructure and et cetera. So you suddenly realize everybody's actually putting pressure on each other in a positive way to actually deliver on the science-based targets. And sorry, I didn't realize that before, but maybe it's because I'm stupid, but we have an audience of ordinary people out there watching this. They're not all experts on trucks and supply chains and Scope 1 and Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions and stuff like that. And I think they need to understand a little bit that the interesting simplicity of what you're actually all doing is absolutely riveting. Okay, let's talk about charging infrastructure, shall we? Maybe I could ask Evalena, but I could also ask Jimmi and Massimo. I mean, where is this investment going to come from? Where do you see it arising? I see from the presentation, companies are taking their own decisions to install them, as it were, locally with their businesses. But for the long-distance stuff, obviously, or even maybe the medium-distance stuff, you need more charging points for these big vehicles, right? So whose responsibility is this? Who's going to do it? You tell me.
I can start if you want.
Okay, super.
Yeah. So when we speak about investment, and talking of now, because we see that something needs to be done already now. As I said before, the biggest part of the fleet today is still diesel truck and gas truck. So the highest level of investment, from my point of view, should be placed now in the production of biofuel. Because this biofuel can be directly used immediately in this huge fleet that is already available. In parallel, we are talking of electrification, of course. Infrastructure is very important, but also subsidies, because today the price of this technology is still very high. So without the contribution of the local government, today is still very difficult.
Do you see that? Yeah?
Yeah, I can add from a transportation buyer point of view. Of course, we set demands to our partners, and we call it a partnership, of course, because everybody needs to contribute to make a difference to a more sustainable transportation solution. And not being a buyer just focus on price, we also need to contribute to be a more flexible approach, you can say, to do it together and not having one way. So that's why we're here today also to present it as one unit.
What happens in a city like Stockholm when they say we're gonna not have diesel coming into this city? Do they then automatically install the charging points in Stockholm, or no, it doesn't work like that? Okay, I'm just really interested because they say no more diesel.
No, it is,
and then, yeah.
It is partially true what is happening, because what is happening in Stockholm, like in other cities, is that going with the zero-emission truck, so I said already in the presentation, they give to the company higher flexibility, meaning that you can make your delivery in the city center during moment of the day, the night, of course, where normally is forbidden. And this, what does it mean? It means that you can use your truck much more. So the occupancy of your fleet increase, and of course also the total cost decrease. This is what is happening already. Right. And this is the invitation that I was trying to give during my presentation. So we need this type of restriction increasing in order to facilitate the implementation of other truck type.
Right. Interesting. Evalena, for you, this is a big issue, yes? I mean, the charging infrastructure. I don't know. I'm ignorant. I have no idea how many charging points there are in just Western Europe. I mean, I don't know if that's... And are they different charging points for trucks versus cars, or is it the same? It is different.
I think that is one of the challenges that are very often overlooked when it comes to electrical trucks versus electrical cars, because the investments that are needed are much bigger when it comes to electrical trucks. So as an example, a fast charger for trucks is much more expensive than it is for passenger cars. And the other key challenge is that the truck operators, they have a very tight time schedule. Typically, you say that it's a very low margin industry. So, I mean, typically you say they make money between Christmas and New Year's. So obviously stopping for charging and for waiting for charging is not possible. It has to be done in a very efficient and smooth way. So this means there's a huge need for infrastructure. We will do our share from that from Scania. We are even working together with our competitors to form a joint venture to put 1,700 charging points across the main roads of Europe. But that is, of course, by far not enough. So this is where we need to work together also with the authorities, the policymakers, to ensure that we can have infrastructure and that the investments are made in the grid, because the grid capacity is simply not enough to cater for the need that we will see with the increased possibilities. So the technology will be there, but is it possible to deploy it? Well, it will depend on the development of the infrastructure.
Yeah. I mean, is every country in Europe committed to expanding this grid, this charging infrastructure, or is everybody taking a different approach? I mean, I'm just thinking about a truck making a journey from, you know, Stockholm down through Denmark, might get into France, might go... I mean, are there going to be places where there's going to be loads of charging infrastructure and there's not going to be any charging infrastructure? What about Portugal? I don't know. Or is there a common approach on this in Europe? And if there isn't, what do we do about it, right? Do we have to go and call our politicians now? Anybody want to handle that? Is it patchy? What is going on? I'm quite curious.
But that's a very good point. What we see is that the rules and legislation and the way the countries act are not harmonized at all.
Right.
So we have different dimensions allowed for trucks. We have subsidies in some countries. We saw it with the example with Alfa Laval. We have subsidies in Sweden and in Germany, but not in Denmark.
Right.
So this needs to be harmonized. It's a huge problem that it's not dealt with in a mutual way.
Right.
But what we also see with the national policies is that we need to have enough power in the grid.
Yeah.
So is the grid strong enough to have 10 trucks in a certain location that are charging this amount of voltage? This is important, but also that the energy that we take from the chargers are renewable energy. So we need a lot of these things besides the subsidies and all this. But
it's a bit chicken and egg, isn't it, right? What comes first, yeah?
Yeah, and we have to create the demand for it. So if we start with individual solutions, that's good enough. But if we want to accelerate this, then we need to go together in larger partnerships, share data, find out where are the gateways in Europe, in US, where we need the chargers. So it's not a single solution, but it's a solution where we can deploy electric trucks and run in these huge gateways that everybody can use. And it would be nice also if we have fast chargers in the airports, in the ports, in the railway stations, where cargo comes in and out. That could help a lot. That is also infrastructure.
Is there some city planning here as well? Because, I mean, on the edge of cities is where often big trucks end up, yeah? And then it goes into smaller things and smaller things and smaller things down to maybe even bicycles or whatever, it's Deutsche Post. Okay, anyway, probably spent too much on this, but it's just really quite interesting, actually. I mean, ordinary people have no idea how complex these things are, and I'm an ordinary person, so I'm speaking on behalf of all the listeners. Yeah, I mean, Martin, I was going to ask you a question again about national policies to scale zero-emission goods-carrying vehicles. You kind of touched on this a bit. I mean, hasn't the world all been shocked by the war in the Ukraine, but at the same time, hasn't this been a massive wake-up call for those politicians in Europe who basically are saying, yeah, we're doing good on renewable energy, we're doing fine, and everybody's going, right, we're just still chasing our own tails. It's actually growing, but it's not growing fast enough. Do you think there could be a big change on this as a silver lining out of a very dark cloud?
I think that's a very, let's say, something positive can come out of this very, very terrible situation, of course. Because we do see a lot of, let's say, willingness to create more independence from, of course, the sources that we've been used to. So I think there will be a lot of investments into green energy solutions, both when it comes to electrical solutions, but also biogas solutions. We see a big interest for that. And for me, I mean, I think we need both. We need to develop both types of infrastructure to enable the steep growth that we would like to see. And let's remember, I mean, also for companies, I mean, there is something positive about this shift also to take control of your costs. Because if you actually develop your own solution and find your way of having renewable energy that you create in a circular way for your company, then you're also controlling the complete cost for your transport solution, which was not possible when you were relying on the diesel pricing going up and down in the past. So I think there will be something positive coming out, both in terms of more investments into the sector in general, and also for companies when they look at how to control the cost of the transport solutions.
Anybody else see a shift in thinking on renewable energy? Because if you need more renewable energy to do the chargers, then we need to really scale up much faster than we're doing in Europe alone. I mean, I know renewable energy is doubling every 3.5 years or whatever, and it's fantastic, it's reached exponential, but I don't know if there's another phrase, exponential growth, but that would seem to be in order. Where does all this go in terms of what you've learnt beyond the shores of Europe? I mean, does Havi operate in Bangladesh and India and Japan and other places around the world?
Yeah, we operate in Europe in terms of logistics, not in all the market. Of course, Europe is by far more advanced when we speak and we compare with Asia. Honestly, in terms of renewable energy today, so we have also distribution centers in addition to a big fleet. And I could say that today the percentage of renewable energy that we use in all our distribution centers across Europe is 99%. So is already quite high. So this, for me, does not represent the problem in this picture. For me, the problem, as Martin said, is, first of all, to have a common approach when we speak about subsidies, when we speak about regulation, because today is still a jungle. So you need a multinational company operating in different markets, needs to spend a lot of time to understand what is the rule in Sweden, what is the rule in Italy, in Spain, and this cannot be. And they are changing very quick. So a decision that you take today may be not valid for tomorrow. This is the problem today.
But I think it's a very valid question, just to add on to the topic of going outside of Europe, because for me that is a super important question. I mean, we all are focused on taking the first steps of electrification in Europe and so on, but we do have a lot of operations outside as well that we need to work on. And right now we see some promising development in Latin America, where there is investments in biomethane going on, starting in Brazil, but also moving into some of the other countries. We actually decided also some months ago to launch our first battery electric truck in Mexico, of all countries. Wow. And that was an experience in itself. Talking about the total cost of ownership, it will not be possible to find a parity versus diesel, because there they still have subsidiaries for diesel.
Well, I was just going to come to that, yeah.
instead of to get support to implement an electric truck. So it goes the other direction. But still, it was an important step for us, because also there we need to understand in what kind of operations, and there are big corporations also there. We have partnerships that are driving this topic and really want to experience also electric trucks in Mexico. So hopefully they can show the way. It will not be done by policy in these markets, I would say. It will definitely be done by private investors. But we have definitely also key stakeholders that want to show the way on this topic also outside of Europe.
Yeah. So you mentioned subsidies, and maybe I wasn't paying attention because, of course, you just raised the fossil fuel subsidy story. I interviewed her CEO in Glasgow at the Climate COP, and we were pointing to a counter on the screen, counting up the amount of money governments have spent on fossil fuel subsidies since the beginning of the climate conference in Glasgow. And he was one of many who went, that's just absolutely crazy, you know. And, it really does seem pretty crazy actually sitting here. But are there other subsidies that we should be aware of? You've mentioned subsidies several times. Is it fossil fuel subsidies you're referring to or something else?
No, the subsidies that I'm mentioning are two types. First of all, subsidies in order to subsidize the production of biofuel.
Okay.
This is important because today,
so there are positive subsidies and negative. I think we should just clear that up, yeah.
Yes, and also subsidies on technologies.
Yeah.
So these are the two types that today are important to have.
Exactly. So you need subsidies on those that deliver the goals that we want in society right now, which is acting on climate change, for example, and to get rid of the other subsidies for companies which are hardly startups, like the major oil companies, which actually skew the playing field against the electrification of vehicles and renewable energy. So so not all subsidies are bad, or at the right time, they might be very useful. Yeah, biofuels, for example.
And we see subsidies in some countries on electric trucks. We see subsidies on charging infrastructure, but not in all countries. Right. So that's the harmonization that could be great, that we can ensure when we want to deploy this, that these are the rules and subsidies that we can work with.
Yeah. Well, I don't work for the EU, and I'm British, so I can't really talk about Europe anymore. But it would seem if the EU could get its act together on some kind of common position on this, it would be quite useful. Okay, look, we are really running out of time. We're at 30 seconds, and I'm sorry if I haven't asked all the questions, but the things we were talking about were so interesting anyway. Let's think about COP27 in Egypt in November. Is there something that you're going to bring as a common position on this in terms of what we've seen presented today? Or if not, what do you want to see the governments do in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt?
How we see the future and looking at the COP in 27.
Yeah.
Well, we hope that the transition fuels and all the efforts that are coming from joining forces will take us a long way until we get, support from new technologies, from hydrogen-based fuels. So we hope that we can get there. But we are also starting now to arrange, working groups with the Exponential Roadmap initiative to go together and start sharing data, and this needs to have some good results before we meet again to a big status.
Okay.
In 27.
Briefly, everybody else, because we're running out of time. Any thoughts?
You say Alfa Laval today produce and innovative and sustainable products already, and our focus on the outbound for transportation is, of course, to put pressure on this team here and ensure that we have a common goal. to do better, not only on air freight, but every transportation mode worldwide, so as a global company.
Massimo, yes. So for me, the commitment is to continue to be committed in this approach of partnership. So this is for me the key for the future. So you said before, my target is also the target of Scania, is also the target of somebody else.
Yes, it's the most interesting thing about
having clear this in mind, I think this is the best way to move forward.
Yeah, got you.
I think our main contribution, apart from the technology, which is obviously our responsibility, is also to do this kind of analysis that we have shared with you today, because it is important to not only look at the CO2 reductions that are possible with different technologies, but also look at the cost of operations, to combine those two. But I also look forward very much to what Martin referred to, the collaboration within the Exponential Roadmap, to really find possibilities to drive these kind of topics. If we go together with all of the forces of the different members of the Exponential Roadmap, then I think we have the opportunity to influence governments if we see that there is an opportunity for a lot of transports in a certain country to get that infrastructure in place to make it happen.
Good. And I look forward to cancelling fossil fuel subsidies and spending it all on renewable energy and charging infrastructure. There we go. All right, we've all finished. Thank you very much. It was really interesting. Well done. Really enjoyed it, and hope to see you all again sometime soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go this way. And I'll welcome Katarina back to the stage for the next session. I may have got that in wrong order, but I think it will be there. Okay, bye.
Thanks for great insights. Now I'd like to call up Andreas Follér and Rasmus Valanko and Matt Rogers to discuss the blockers and opportunities for fast-forward scaling. So please join me here on stage. Take a seat. I'm going to sit in this chair, so you can choose the sofa or the armchair to the side here. And it's wonderful to have you here, all three of you. And you've been listening in on the session here before, so you know a little bit about what's going on. It's been going on the stage. We were watching it from the green room somewhat before. And you're all representing different sections of this transition. And today we're going to talk about the blockers, removing the blockers. And I'd like to start with you, Andreas. Yeah. What are the major transitions and what blockers do we really need to start removing fast?
Well, it's a big question, but to give you the headlines, and I think this excellent panel has been into all parts of it, we need to get the right incentives and regulations in place to move the TCO parity between diesel and zero emission closer. We need the charging infrastructure. And hopefully we're going to get back to that, but it's been also covered in the previous section really well, I think. And finally, we need to be bold when it comes to putting the right demand signals to the transport operators, because these are low margin, low risk players. We can't expect them to do all the heavy lifting. Transport buyers need to ensure that there is demand so we can de-risk the investments. So that's the headlines of the enablers that we're needing.
And you need to get a proper presentation. You are head of sustainability at Scania. I just said your name initially. And of course, Matt, you also need a proper presentation. You're from the We Mean Business Coalition, and you're CEO at Mission Possible, not Mission Impossible.
Mission Possible.
I'm sure possible, exactly. That's a different story. And Rasmus, you're Managing Director Systems Transformation at the We Mean Business Coalition. So we just get that straight. We Mean Business Coalition and Mission Possible.
There we go. All
right. So Andreas, in terms of scaling low emission transport solutions, that's what Scania is doing. So from your perspective, what needs to be put in place to make this happen?
Well, first of all, the technology is already there. There are no major obstacles left when it comes to technology. And what we need to focus 100% on now is the large-scale adoption. At Scania, we believe that, to put it simple, we will double the volumes of zero-emission vehicles every year now, reaching 10% of our volumes by 2025 already, which is also the year where we will have all our applications in a battery electric version. 2030, 50% of our volumes is an estimate. So what is needed now is that we are helping the adoption. We're standing behind the EU Green Deal 100%, especially the ETS2, which put road transport into an emission trading system. And this is crucial because if we can put a price on carbon, then it will help the adoption very much. We see countries like Germany, France, the Netherlands subsidizing battery electric vehicles now, which is great. Low emission zones, road toll waivers are the other examples of pieces that we need on the way. So these are some examples of what is already going on and that will help us scale.
So Rasmus, what are your reflections after having listened to all the previous speakers, but also specifically Andreas here?
So if we take a step back all the way to the beginning of the session, really, and thinking about what Johan was saying about the need for exponential change, you know, there's really two challenges when it comes to trucking, but other sectors as well, which is the need for speed. We need to accelerate the change. It's not a given that it will be exponential. And that's why we're talking about the obstacles now here, right? And the other thing to also remember is that when you're talking about an exponential change, it's also a systemic change. And a systemic change is things about like changing our whole energy system, right? It's about changing our transport system. So these aren't really small things. And the one thing that is in common really here is that we need so many different actors to do their part for that exponential change to actually happen. And so Andreas already talked about the role of governments in terms of putting into place either the incentives or disincentives for companies to take action, for example. But we also have other stakeholders who need to do their part. If you think about companies, you've got the supply side and the demand side. Earlier we were talking about passenger electric vehicles, but actually there's quite a few customers out there today who are waiting for the electric vehicles and not getting them because there's a semiconductor shortage, right? So there are these bottlenecks that are coming up as well on the supply side. And I think what's really important for the kinds of conversations we're having here today is that we're improving, actually, by virtue of being here, our ability to coordinate amongst these different stakeholders, because we're sharing information about what the plans are that companies or others have. It allows us to plan and preempt and take coordinated action. I mean, Andreas was just talking about the demand signals, right? So you've got things like the First Movers Coalition, you know, you've also got EV100+, who are really there to aggregate demand for example, electric trucks, and send a very strong signal to the market so that the OEMs manufacture the trucks, that they're ready for it. So we need these kinds of much more open dialogue and planning together around roadmaps so that we don't end up with these bottlenecks like a semiconductor shortage or earlier talking about charging points not being available on long routes between countries.
So apart from this, from a session like this and the entire day like this and the entire week like this, what else is needed to make sure that the bottlenecks don't occur in terms of communication and collaboration?
So it's I think a really good example, and I'm going to maybe steal a little bit of Matt's thunder here. You know, so we've had for a long time, you know, different kinds of technology roadmaps that have come out from the IEA or, you know, informed by the IPCC, et cetera. And I'd say that now some of the best roadmaps that are available for how a sector is expected to change are coming from the Mission Possible partnership, right? And that gives a level of granularity which allows you to really plan your business. It really shows, you know, who needs to do what. And I think that's the key is that it's good enough to talk about, you know, being on stage, etc., but you need a tool. You need something which is specific in terms of who needs to do what when, so that you get that coordinated action. And you know, you by virtue of developing a roadmap together in a collaborative way, you also build a shared vision. We heard that earlier as well, that shared vision, how important it is, that Nigel was talking about as well. If you have that shared vision, an understanding of what the roles are and what your capabilities as a policymaker are, or as a NGO representative, or, you know, a manufacturer, if you understand that role and you share your intent with the other stakeholders, then you can unlock some of those very tangible and concrete actions that are on your shared roadmap.
Thank you for pointing it out so clearly. And Matt, any comments?
Well, I think if you look at the roadmaps that we've laid out for heavy-duty trucking as a simple example, we would argue that we need to get to 10 million net zero trucks by 2030. In the next 8 years. We talk about exponential growth. You were describing what that looks like. That is a remarkable ramp up, and it's a ramp up for the original equipment manufacturers. So we have to make those trucks. It's a ramp up for the fueling stations, whether it's hydrogen or whether it's electric. We have to make sure that we put those in place. And then it's a ramp up for all of the pieces that go behind that. So for every charging station, we need more renewables. For every hydrogen station, we need more hydrogen. Then we need more renewables. And really understanding that full value chain and understanding how we build that up in a disciplined fashion. The good news about trucking, as a simple one, is that we know route structures. We actually know where the trucks go, and we know there are some high-density routes. And so we can be actually quite efficient in where we locate fueling infrastructure to match up with what those route structures look like. If we do it with one hand not talking to the other hand, we'll build charging stations over here and the truck routes will be over there, and that won't actually help things very much. And then we have some very practical pieces, because we need to, for example, get permits for fueling infrastructure. And sometimes those permits, it takes 3 or 4 months to build a fueling station. On the other hand, it may take 3 or 4 years to get the approval to do that. And if we take 3 or 4 years for the permit, there's no way we get the exponential growth. And so how do we begin to work with regulatory authorities to say, this is what the map of fueling infrastructure needs to look like. Can you please approve all of these for the next 8 years in one block and make sure that it's, you know, very straightforward, and we don't have to all wait in line or go to 17 different regulatory authorities to get the stamp on the permit to make that happen. So there's some of those kind of basics. And then there are other basics, like we actually need more electricians to make electric trucks workable. We need to train up people. Over time, if you look at the number of people that are required to support that kind of infrastructure, just at the human level, at the electrician level, we don't have enough. And how do we get enough of the trade schools bringing folks forward? Because we've got jobs now for the next 30 years for the next generation, but we aren't actually training up enough in order to support the infrastructure that we're going to build out here.
I understand there's also a need for programmers for the computer back end of this transition. So Matt, in terms of what Andreas touched a bit in the beginning about the need for policies, and so did you. So how do we put pressure on the decision makers to really make sure that these policies fall in place in the right time, so they don't make up blockers?
I think this is quite an important topic, because what we have to somehow get is a mindset of urgency. When we put our minds together and we get a mindset of urgency, we actually can get a lot done relatively quickly, but it actually has to be across the value chain. So we need to have the equipment suppliers and the truck suppliers and the shippers and the truck drivers. We need to get them, if you will, all in a room in a relatively short period of time. We actually know what the policy requirements are. It's not very complicated. There are 5 or 6 things that I think we could all write down that we would agree on, but we need to get that room together and make those decisions like by the end of this year. Like it only takes about 6 months to actually put in place those things. And somehow it has become common to say, well, maybe we should just extend the discussion longer. And my simple one is, from all of these things, we need standards by the end of this year. There's no reason not to have standards by the end of 2022 for what the trucking requirements are. What does it mean to have a net zero truck? We should be clear about that. What's the appropriate carbon intensity for a biofuel versus hydrogen versus electric? We know how to do that math. But we need to get all the right people in the room, and then we need to hold our elected officials accountable for deciding and putting it off to the next generation. There is no excuse for taking longer than the next 6 months to make those kind of decisions.
So Andreas, your view here, you would obviously be one of the players in the room. So what is your reflections on the policy topic here, more in depth?
I think we all share the sense of urgency. We have to get this right now, and that's why we are doing something that we haven't done before. We are 100% transparent with our product development plans. We're sharing that with everybody now, so you can see it. We show when our products are coming. We are transparent with our volume predictions. That used to be business secret, highly confidential. Now we want the world to know, because we have to work concerted on this. Policymakers on all levels need to do their part here, because if we're talking about charging infrastructure, which we tend to do here, it's massive investments in the grid, and it's massive investments in that last piece of the grid that will take the effect, the capacity out to where it's needed. We have already in 2022 customers that asks their regional grids if they can be extended to their depots, and they hear, yes, in 8 years.
Oh, good Lord!
In 8 years, we will be able to help you here. I mean, that's what we're talking about, and that needs to change. And I think the name of the game here is transparency from all parts. We can do this, but we need to know how to do it in a concerted way.
So this goes all the way up to, well, the highest level of planning for infrastructure in terms of electricity. Just in Sweden, we know that we need a doubling of the electricity output quickly in order to make this transition possible.
Yeah. And that's not so much of that is going to transport, actually. It's less than what you think, because it's such an energy efficient way of using energy. Most of it is going to the steel and the cement.
Yes,
which is great.
The industry. But you have your share, and you're part of pushing for more renewable energy in the system as a whole. So Rasmus, let's dwell a bit from your perspective also on policies, because who would you like to see in this room?
Well, it depends which part of the world we're trying to tackle first, right? So I see this happening really at two levels. So what has been incredibly useful is that companies at the highest level, when they're meeting at, the COP meetings, for example, in Glasgow or later in Sharm el-Sheikh, there we're talking at the level of nationally determined contributions. So in other words, what is the overall goal of the country, and what are the key components of the plan to get to that goal, right? So that's certainly what we need, and that gives companies, a good idea of what is the direction of travel and the speed for the different countries. But that's kind of not enough, because nobody builds a charging station at a global level or at a COP meeting, right? Where you put a charging station in place, it's on a street or at a depot or a physical place with GPS coordinates. And so wherever you're wanting to take real action, you have to involve also the very lowest levels of decision making in government as well. So it's not just about countries, it's about states, it's about cities. Complex. It's not about the ministers always, it's about the person who's in charge of parking in the city of Amsterdam, right? And I think we need to have two conversations at two levels. One that gives confidence about the general direction and speed of travel, and the other one about how are we going to solve this locally. And again, I think they're very similar, though, in the sense that you need to bring all the players around the table in both cases. And one I just don't want to forget, because there's a tendency to kind of point fingers a little bit in these kinds of conversations. Well, we would do more if you only did that. But and there's quite a lot of finger pointing on the governments. But we really do need to see governments as partners, right? And the other constituency is civil society. I'm sure there's also plenty of people following this, you know, who are wondering what can they do as individuals as well. And there's really two things: it's vote or put pressure on your either local or national level decision makers to say that this is what you want. And of course, the other one is, you know, make smart choices in terms of where you put your money. You know, buy that electric vehicle if you can, or get that taxi which is electric, or, you know, buy off Amazon with, you know, or ask, you know, the companies to deliver with electric, right? So there's many components, but I think this idea of having, there's two levels. One is about direction, the other one's about action, but you really do need everybody involved.
Matt, you're nodding, yeah.
Yeah, no, and I do think this is a really important idea, which is the action comes at a very local level. So one of the places that we get very excited about are things like ports, because we've mapped out 10 green shipping corridors for deep sea vessels. They all land and then they put their materials on trucks. And so how do you create the infrastructure at the port level in order to support the ships and to support the trucks? By the way, most of them are close to airports, so how do we make sure that we support the airport infrastructure? And the ability to work across industries to build up the infrastructure in a disciplined fashion is quite important. Ports are a good example where the Port Authority is, you know, a landlord on the one hand, a regulator, they're a participant in infrastructure development, but they can actually coordinate a whole set and be an orchestrator of a whole set of businesses and industries that are there at the port facility or in the surrounding area. I was up in Luleå yesterday, and the mayor there is a force for nature and a force for good. And what we observe, we're trying to get 150 industrial clusters, industrial hubs around the world to start focusing on how do I decarbonize at the local level. And because what you need then is the local mayor to say, I need to get more teachers because of all the people that are coming here. I need to get more doctors to come into town. I need to think about the very local infrastructure. And a powerful mayor, a powerful local leadership turns out to be as important or more important than a whole set of natural endowments. There are places in the world that have great renewables, but lousy leaders. I'll take a place that has a great local leader, and they'll figure out how to solve a set of the infrastructure problems way more quickly. And I think the power and the importance of that local leadership. The other bit is things like the health impacts from converting over to net zero trucking, because what we do, we always talk about greenhouse gas emissions, but we also need to understand particulate emissions and NOx emissions that have very important health outcomes at the local level, and getting the communities on board with making those conversions helps move these things ahead at a much faster rate.
We had in a previous session today a young activist she's thanking all the EV drivers she can come across for the benefit of the respiratory health and health for the children. So that's health, I think, is a very good aspect, even in more conservative sectors where people do not really want to talk about still climate change. But they can talk about health aspects of pollution. So Rasmus, companies and entities that are part of the Race to Zero campaign, they soon mobilize 50% of GDP. Which is promising. It's still not good enough, but it is very promising. How can we translate this into more demand for the low-emission transport? There's a big push here, but the pull also.
Yeah, so 50% of world GDP, you can get to those kind of big numbers quite quickly with a handful of very big companies, right? So if you think in terms of numbers of companies, it may not actually be that many, right? So I think that, you know, one of the really important levers that we have to pull is that where we have some large multinational companies really leaning in, taking responsibility to take on, let's say, a slightly higher cost, like a price premium, for example, to implement something. Maybe thinking about, historical emissions, because that's how they built their business. These companies, they have an incredible responsibility, but also an incredible opportunity as well to bring along with them the other 50% of GDP. When we're talking about the other 50%, it's medium-sized or small enterprises as well. How can these companies, be very clear about what their expectations are, for example, on their suppliers, but also help those suppliers, not just saying we won't buy from you if you aren't zero emissions, but saying, look, we've started to solve this problem. We've got a huge team of sustainability experts. This is what we've done. Here's some tools that we've developed that we're going to make available for you as well, so that you can come on this journey. There's a great example of how, like, a lot of companies, these large multinationals, amongst others, are banding together. We've got, together with Exponential Roadmap, an initiative called the SME Climate Hub, which tries to do exactly that. It tries to really provide the tools and resources to get more of the global GDP onto this journey. Depends. Well, I hope I answered your question.
You did.
Okay.
Thank you. And I know I've seen Andreas looking at me, so you want to come in here? Great. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I was just building on what Rasmus is saying. I think, and also what Nick has been asking all his guests today, the expectations moving forward. I mean, if we looked at the previous COP, it was the COP of the pledges, of the commitments, and that's all great. But now it's time to get down to really starting to realize this, and let's talk about paying a little bit more for transports. I think that's something that we need to be prepared for. I mean, these solutions that we're talking about will carry themselves, and they will be more profitable than the conventional transport solutions moving forward. There's no doubt. They're superior in any standards. But there will be a period now when we have to pay a price premium. So what we're doing at Scania is that we have allocated a budget for 20 million euros up to 2025 to help us reach our target to half the emissions from our own logistics 2015 to 2025. And we will install, of course, the equipment needed for battery electric charging in our premises. We need to step up as transport buyers and also as individuals, and be prepared to maybe carry some of the costs here and carry these transport companies over this buckle.
Can I just build on that? Yeah. So if you think about the systems which we rely on today, like the energy system or the road system, etc., these have been built out over decades, right? And we've had decades to really optimize them, right? Like, we've squeezed out every use we can out of them, right? I mean, we have roads made out of bitumen because we wanted to burn the stuff and we had something left over, and then we needed to find something to do with, right? So this price premium is not forever, right? It's for a few years. And by companies like Scania leaning into the challenge and others, then what we have the opportunity to do as we scale up and become more efficient, we essentially recover that price premium, right? It goes away. And you have to really think in terms of, this is a big challenge. This is a systemic transformation that we're trying to do in an exponential way. And of course, the first few moves here and part of this beginning of the transition, you have things like a price premium, or, customers think, well, I have to pay maybe, 20 cents more for my Nikes, oh my God, right? But these are things we can absorb. And as time goes on, we will find out ways to work between the sectors, as Matt was pointing out. Industrial hubs are such a great example of that, where, one company's waste or byproduct becomes another company's raw material, or waste heat can be reused in the district heating system, etc. So this is completely possible, But it does mean that maybe there's a couple of years where we need some support, where companies are leading, but then also governments are supporting, to the earlier points, around providing subsidies for the right things and removing the subsidies for the wrong things.
Exactly. I was just getting to the subsidies. It's Nick's favorite question and mine too. I mean, we do still have fossil subsidies going on big time. And what impact would this have for your transition, the journey that you all three are part of, if they would be to be removed? That would be a major blocker, wouldn't it, Matt?
Yeah, they step one, levelize the playing field and take the subsidies off, all of a sudden would make one quick shift. The other one, by the way, is there are subsidies even between sectors. So the aviation sector versus the trucking sector. And so what we need to do is, if we don't get a levelized playing field, what happens is we misallocate resources and we misallocate them systematically. And that's about how do we price power, it's how do we price fuel. And so beginning to understand what those are and levelize the playing field, I think, become quite important. And then begin to put in place things that allow the development of infrastructure at a rapid enough rate that you can scale up, right? Because one of the, again, we are used to having infrastructure installed that we installed 30 years ago, and then we forget, we just use the operating costs. And we actually do have to put new capital into the system to create a much more reliable, much more resilient, much more accessible, much more affordable system. But we do have to put some capital up now, and creating the incentives to bring that capital into the market is really quite important.
Mm-hmm. So let's just summarize a bit here, because we need to have a sharp call to action for the COP, the coming COP. What would that be from your perspective, Rasmus? You will be there, I'm sure, but just for the viewers, we have millions of viewers watching this. So.
Well, we haven't quite decided exactly, what we're going to be doing at COP. Or it's never really one thing, it's many, right? I mean, we're on the same page as Nigel very much around, we've kind of figured out the rule book, and we've negotiated enough commas now. It's really a COP about action. And, maybe back to my original point in the very beginning, COP is a great place where you bring governments, companies, civil society, academia as well, and others together to be quite open and share what the plans are. But it's also a great, let's say, forcing mechanism as a bit of a deadline to work towards.
It is. That's my question.
Right? So I think the way that we hope to use COP, and I think a lot of other people will use COP, is really about how can we really work in the months intervening to develop either new collaborations or partnerships for real action. So more of this local level action around maybe industrial hubs that can be announced really at COP and make them very well known so that everybody can react and plan accordingly.
Big team coming, pushing it.
Several teams.
Several teams. Andreas?
No, I think, as the transport panel said previous to this session, this needs to be a race to the top, and we really need to make sure that we find those best practices when it comes to policies, incentives, charging infrastructure, and demand signals, and then make sure that that is being the standard across markets. So we're going to be there, and we're gonna give these messages that we're ready for large-scale adoption. The technology is there. Now it's just about being bold and ambitious.
Bold and ambitious. We like that. Thank you, Andreas. And Matt?
The time for talking is over. We're going to get evaluated on gigatons abated, not PowerPoints created or new commitments written down on some piece of paper. It's really about, companies like Scania that have stepped up and said, these are the projects we're actually going to go do. Here's the time frame over which we're going to go do them. And I think that's the measure of merit. The measure of merit is what projects are we going to do. We know we need, for example, 300 sustainable aviation fuel plants by 2030. If we get to the COP in Abu Dhabi 18 months from now and we don't have 100 of them already at final investment decision, we are way behind. And the nice part is we have to take the time horizon from 2050 to 2030 now to 2025 and say which projects are we putting capital into by 2025? where they're really going to be operational, then we'll know we're making real progress. But until then, it's all talk.
Well, we know that you are doing your best. That's been very obvious in this panel and all the other previous panels in this ERI segment. And it's wonderful to have you here on board on our stage here today. And we'll probably see each other in Egypt. And I'm looking forward to the progress that you're creating together to take part of that and enjoy it. Enjoy the ride. Well, thank you so much, Matt. Thank you very much, Andreas. And thank you, Rasmus.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'd like to be joined now by Johan Falk and Ingmar Rentzhog for some reflections on today's session here on transport. So Johan, as a co-founder of the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, what are your main takeaways here? What are your reflections, please?
Yeah, I think working in 1.5 value chains, that is and will be the game changer. We talked a lot about what companies do, a lot about the solutions. The way to do it is to work in value chains. And you have to do that with suppliers, which has the same compass direction, and customers. They have to have the same direction, the same ambition, the same speed. And if you can then connect these, as we heard about brilliant examples from Polestar, from Scania and the team, which I think was excellent, basically. If you then can connect that to leading cities and regions going in the front line, as well as governments to actually push these precise levers, I think that way of working can help us to break through in the next stage. So we need to find a way to work which we can copy through different sectors.
Thank you, Johan.
That's what I'm thinking.
Ingmar, from a communications expert's perspective, and also that we don't have time, what's happening on the app in terms of what's happening here on stage today, what are your reflections?
My reflection today is I'm amazed. Because on all our shows we have seen corporation and policymakers and others cooperate with each other, but not on this level. We had global companies doing different things in supply chain, not just presenting what they are doing together in a project. They are getting up here wearing the same color on the clothes, coordinate slides, presenting not like 5 companies, but like one initiative. And the focus is not their own profit. The focus is what they are going to achieve together. This is why I believe in the 100%, that we're going to reach the emission targets. We just need to do it faster. And one way to do it faster is to do it together and involve others. And I think it's amazing. There's a lot of effort behind that. And we're going to see now the whole economy changing. Instead of competing, we're going to cooperate. Of course, we're going to compete like in sports, but we also need to cooperate with each other in order to reach the bigger objective.
It's clear that we're in this race together.
Yeah, I mean, it's a race of survival. So if we can't cooperate, no one will win. But I will also see this approach on the political arena. And we don't do that. And I think that's a shame. Why don't we have leading politicals, different parties, talk and present on how they are going to solve this? Why are they not here? It's not, I mean, we have invited them. We have room in the audience. Where are you?
Well, good final words for this session, and thank you all for watching. We are now handing over to Spotify for their segment, and we'll continue later on today. Thank you for now.
are listening to 2072, a Spotify original. This episode is called Ragna, a short story written by Henrik Björn, told by Gizem Kling Erdogan. The story takes place 50 years from now, in a reality that might be ours according to contemporary science.
It was my 12th autumn, and in the days before everything changed. It was a happy time. I had everything I needed, and above all, I had Grandpa. He was a mother and a father to me, and my best friend. My only friend, actually. My loneliness was not caused by some kind of social problem. It was simply down to the fact that there were no other people in our forest. But although I felt safe in our cabin and was relatively well fed, a nagging sense of worry had begun to build after the summer. Sometimes the dark thoughts took over, and I felt like I was going to be sucked into a black hole and simply vanish. Maybe this is what growing up feels like, I thought. Seeing the bigger picture, beginning to understand things I was previously unaware of. Yeah, that must be it. I had started to worry like an adult. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but the ominous lump grew bigger by the day, layer by layer, until it felt like it had permanently settled in my chest. That night, I lay on the sofa bed in the kitchen, trying to escape my thoughts with a children's book I must have read 1,000 times. I wanted to think about something other than the things I didn't even know about, and could even less influence. One day at a time, Liv. I jumped at the noise. But it was just Grandpa. Who else could it be? His thick silver hair stood on end, as if he was still battling the wind outside. I looked at his face, the white stubble of his beard, the deep wrinkles. Can you hear the rumbling? Thor is in a really bad mood tonight, he said, and hung his worn tunic up to dry by the stove. The ones that people worshipped thousands of years ago. We have much to learn from the people of long ago, he used to say. They knew how to live alongside nature without destroying it. It was when we started playing God ourselves that everything went wrong. How did it go? I asked, and he smiled wryly in reply. Not great, to be honest. I think the pike have cottoned on to me. Grandpa looked at me reassuringly. It'll work itself out. I'll bait better tomorrow. We sat by the fire, each holding a steaming cup. Grandpa called it coffee, but it was actually made from roasted dandelion roots. Over the years, I had grown accustomed to the bitter taste, but really drank it mostly for Grandpa's sake. You probably wouldn't believe it, but you'd be glad to drink real coffee, he said. Nothing could make him more nostalgic than the miracle drink from a bygone era. The winters are as long and dark as they used to be, but you can't have a good coffee break anymore. There was no escaping from the note of longing in his voice. Grandpa laughed a bit when he saw me swallow a sip. The black gold from Colombia. To think it just disappeared. We didn't know how good we had it because we didn't want to understand how bad it could get. When the heat waves came more frequently and hotter every year, people seemed to think it was a good thing. People could grow grapes in Luleå and have a pool year-round in Skåne, and holiday at home, a staycation. I remember when we had a once-in-a-thousand-years drought for the 4th year in a row, and even then, we didn't do anything other than slather on stronger sun cream. He paused and cracked a little smile, as if he had just thought of something funny. It wasn't until the coffee ran out and the cafe chains began to close that the Swedes realized it was serious. He chuckled a little to himself. Caffeine withdrawal. That was almost worse than what came next. The wars, the Fimbulwinter, and finally the heat. I didn't always understand what Grandpa was talking about. Some pieces of the puzzle were often missing, as if he wanted to spare me the details. But he had told me that it was in the war over fresh water, clean air, and natural resources that everyone in our family had died. My parents, my grandma, until it was just me and Grandpa left. Don't forget that you and I are privileged, he used to say. Nothing can live on the other side of the barrier. We have that to thank for everything. But it's fragile. It wouldn't take much for everything we take for granted to disappear. I was so young when I saw the barrier that it had faded from my memory. Grandpa described it as a huge wall that protected our forest and kept us alive. Sometimes I thought it was built for just the two of us, although of course I understood that this couldn't be true. For as long as I could remember, I had listened to his reassuring voice. I had the feeling that all his stories would be useful to me in the future. For this reason, I often memorized what he said, recited the words to myself at night, and learned things by heart. It suddenly hit me like a punch in the stomach how much I would miss his voice the day it went silent. The realization that we were only here on borrowed time almost made my ears pop. I pushed the thoughts away with my mantra. One day at a time, Liv. Then it happened again. Grandpa looked at me, almost as if he could see what I was thinking. Everything will be fine, Liv, he said. Tomorrow we're going hunting. Because when the pike don't show themselves, you need to switch to plan B. We're going to hike a long way, towards the middle of the forest, so we need to get a good night's sleep. He poked a couple of night logs into the stove, and we went to bed, Grandpa in his sleeping alcove, me in the sofa bed in the small kitchen. It was hard to sleep. My eyes were drawn to the childishly embroidered painting of a forest, the one my mother made when she was my age. Ragna was embroidered in the lower right corner. My mother. I didn't remember her, but thinking of her name always relaxed me, and eventually I was able to fall asleep. We walked in silence, deeper into the forest than I had ever been before. I held my bow with a firm grip, the arrow resting on my arm, but still ready to fire if I needed to. Grandpa had seen tracks of a female roe deer and her 2 fawns the day before, and they were what we were tracking. It was a magical morning. The sun struggled to break through the morning haze. Grandpa breathed the fresh air into his lungs. I looked around and was struck by the forest's beauty. This is primeval forest. When everything else was burning, this forest survived. At first, forest fires were seen as accidents, as something exceptional. But with each passing year, fire became part of the new reality. There were no deciduous trees in the new forest, only spruce planted in neat rows. But this primeval forest held out. It has wet bogs, lush deciduous trees, wet moss, he said, and stopped in his tracks. He put his index finger to his mouth and silenced me, and his eyes turned to glade. On the other side of the grove, 3 beautiful roe deer were feeding on a wild raspberry bush, the mother doe and her 2 fawns. Remember what I taught you, Grandpa whispered, without moving a muscle. Move stealthily, against the wind. Aim for the heart. It takes half a second from the time you shoot the arrow until it hits the target. Adrenaline was pumping through me as I crept through the bushes to find a clear shot. The wind was in my face perfect. I took a deep but silent breath, set the arrow and took aim. But suddenly I had second thoughts. She's so beautiful. She's their mother. I didn't have time to think further because Grandpa was suddenly behind me. He whispered, "She's an old doe, so these are her last fawns. They're big enough to survive on their own now. Besides, without this game we'll starve." I understood, so I pulled the bow back, aimed, and let go of the arrow with a soft but firm movement. The arrow hit the heart center, right where Grandpa taught me. The doe collapsed, dead before she hit the ground. I saw the white backsides of her 2 fawns as they scampered away into the forest. Now it was just the 2 of them, and that made me a bit sad. But Grandpa promised me they would be fine. They were over a year old and they would have left their mother any day now anyway. He looked at me proudly. This meat will last well into winter. We can smoke it and dry it. The roe deer died so we can live, but we only kill as much as we need to. Remember that, champion hunter. We must be part of the forest's own breeding. Grandpa threw the doe in his back and I took the rucksack. Mosquitoes and gnats swarmed around us in the autumn heat. You did a good job, Liv, he said suddenly. I was filled with exhilaration at having actually managed to kill the game. When it mattered most, I hadn't flinched. It was a very satisfying feeling. Some things have to be done even if they're unpleasant, Grandpa said later. That's how you grow as a person. I couldn't have said it better myself, I thought. Tonight we celebrate, he said with a grin. I'll never forget the delicious smells that wafted through the cottage that night. Grandpa took a big knob of salted butter from the mug in the earth cellar and chopped in a couple of handfuls of dried chanterelle mushrooms we had collected in a jar. While Grandpa was stirring the food, he got that look in his eyes, the one that seemed to wander off into the distance. In the beginning we ate loads of meat, too much, he said. Then suddenly there was none to be had at all, unless you were very wealthy, of course. Do you know what we ordinary people had to eat instead? All the crops, the wheat, oats, corn, rice, everything we were used to eating was destroyed. The heat created insects in such enormous numbers that the swarms blocked out the sun. No crops were left after they had been. Our only solution was to put up huge nets. We could get tons of crickets in one catch. Grandpa added a pinch of salt and stirred the pan. It sizzled and an explosion of delightful aromas spread as the chanterelles minged with the onions and tender meat. The insects became our food instead. They're rich in protein. A bit dry and crunchy, but if you added enough salt, they were bearable. The meatballs were actually okay, really. As long as you didn't look at them too closely. I shuddered at the thought. Couldn't you eat fish instead? Grandpa smiled indulgently. The only treats the sea had left to offer was seaweed and jellyfish. They made an acceptable porridge, as long as you held your nose. I laughed at Grandpa's pragmatic attitude. Crickets and jellyfish. It sounds disgusting. Hunger is the best seasoning, he replied with a wry smile. Then he poured some malt beverage into 2 glasses and raised one of them. Here's to you, champion hunter, and here's to the forest for giving us this meal. When we had cleared the table, Grandpa said he wanted us to go out. There's a place you have to see, so you understand what's at stake. The sudden seriousness of his tone made me feel the uneasiness in my chest again. Grandpa fixed his eyes on me. I don't have long left. You know that, Liv. It's almost time for you to fend for yourself. It felt like something was about to burst through my throat. I just wanted to scream. But life is good here, Grandpa, was all I could manage. He smiled his warmest smile. If something feels too good to be true, it usually is, he said. I just wanted to cry, but I couldn't. And deep down, I had known all along. We were here on borrowed time. It was dark when we came out into the yard. Grandpa had packed his rucksack, which worried me. It seemed he was planning a long walk. We walked in silence, first along the path, and then we turned off. The forest was denser here. It was difficult to find a way through. We walked for a long time, until my feet began to ache. I yearned to get home to my warm bed, but Grandpa just kept going, tirelessly. It had started getting lighter when Grandpa finally slowed down. We were on a hill and he swept away some thick spruce branches. I stopped and just stared. At first I didn't know what I was looking at. On the horizon, as far as the eye could see, ran a gigantic wall of grey concrete. The smooth vertical wall was so high that I disappeared up through in the morning mist. It was impossible to see where the wall ended. "The barrier," said Grandpa. "It's time for you to see what's on the other side." The lump in my chest was back again. "But it's dangerous. You said so." He put his big hand on my cheek. "You have to be brave to see the truth, Liv. Are you brave?" I nodded and tried to swallow my worry. We made our way down to the foot of the giant wall. How will we get through? I wondered. "We can't. We're going under," he answered. And at the same moment he grabbed a chain that was buried under layers of grass and moss. He pulled as hard as he could and I helped, not knowing what would happen. Then it was as if something gave way and a hole appeared in the ground. Grandpa took 2 headlamps out of his rucksack and gave one to me. Then he started climbing down into the hole. "Follow me," he said, and disappeared down in the darkness. I stood there for a second, confused. I took a last breath of the fresh morning air and climbed in after him. We walked through a rectangular tunnel. Numbers and notations were painted on the wall. Grandpa usually used to talk and joke, but now he was strangely quiet and serious. As well as that, the tunnel was cold, claustrophobic and creepy. If it wasn't for the headlamps, it would have been pitch black. I can't tell you how far we walked, but it took several hours. I had a sinking feeling that we were treading water, like we were walking in circles. Just then, Grandpa stopped and took his thermos out of his rucksack, taking a couple of sips of water and handing me the thermos. "We're about halfway through the barrier," he said. "Just halfway?" I felt puny standing there. The size and weight of the wall above us was impossible to take in. Then Grandpa asked me if I recognized this place. "We walked through here when we moved in. But you were just a baby." "Of course you don't remember," he said. We carried on walking in silence for a long time. And it was a relief when Grandpa finally stopped. 68 was written on the wall. A sturdy, rusty iron letter led upwards, through a pitch-black hole. Grandpa took a firm grip and started climbing. I followed as closely as I could. We came up to a ledge where a thick, rusty steel door was waiting. A sheltered door, I found myself thinking, without really understanding what the word meant. I asked what was on the other side, but Grandpa didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed the heavy handle and spun it until the locking mechanism slowly opened. He took a respirator out of his rucksack and put it over my head. "Breathe slowly," he said. And then he pushed open the rusty door with all his might. The heat that hit us was stupefying. The air trembled and it was hard to focus my eyes at first. I stumbled out and had a hard time taking in the nightmarish sight. We came out in the middle of a square in a city. Or rather, what once was a city. Despite the heat, everything was covered in grey snow, swirling around and making it difficult to see. Grandpa seemed to understand what I was thinking. "It's ash," he said. "The forests on the other side of the barrier never stop burning." A couple of delicate gray flakes landed on my jacket, and when I brushed them off, they turned into a small black charcoal stain on the fabric. The sun was high in the sky, which was tinged with an unnatural orange glow. It's the soot particles that makes the sky change color, Grandpa explained. It's not blue here, like at home. It had been ages since anyone had lived in this town. The houses were abandoned and covered in soot. Lots of houses and cars had burned and the asphalt had melted, creating deep craters in the streets. To my right, a large lift of some kind had collapsed and was almost covered by the gray ash. In front of me, there was a low building with stairs that disappeared underground, the large windows cracked by the heat. A half-melted sign displaying a blue T hung at the entrance. We walked across the square, past burned car wrecks and metal twisted by the heat. Then I saw the water. It was nasty green from the seaweed and stood several meters too high, judging by some old cranes that had broke the surface like a forest of rusty metal. An acrid, rancid smell from the Dead Sea hit us. Across the Gulf, I could make out poles and towers, like something out of an evil fairy tale. Grandpa saw where I was looking. That's Gröna Lund Fun Fair. The Green Grove, he said. Pretty ironic in retrospect, he added. The heat hung over us like a quivering lid, but we kept walking. Grandpa leading the way and me close behind, down towards a golden-colored bridge. I remember thinking that there was something familiar about this place, even though it was impossible. Everything around us was dead. There were no people, no animals, no plants, just a dry, burnt desert town. I was about to burst into tears. Grandpa noticed. I'm sorry to have to show you all this, Liv, but it's necessary, he said. We came to an alley with old cobblestones. The buildings here looked different. Everything felt old. Grandpa looked at me. We have to hurry. They are waiting. I didn't understand what he was talking about, but he pushed me forward before I could object. We came out into a large square, where the ashes had blown together into a great black heaps that clung to the facades of the old buildings and in through the windows, as if the building were being swallowed by black lava. And suddenly, I saw what he meant. A group of people stood in a circle in the square. They were all wrapped in shawls and wearing face masks, and looked as lost as I felt. When we got closer, I saw that they were no adults. They were all children of my own age, over 20 of them. As far as I could remember, I had never seen another child. I looked at him quizzically. Who are they? Grandpa took my hands and looked me straight in the eye. They're the people who will decide the future. You don't know it yet, but you're one of them too. Go over there and listen. Tell them what you learned and what we experienced together. Grandpa let go of my hands and gave me a hug. Remember one thing. It's never brave to pretend that danger doesn't exist. Bravery is when you see the danger, but overcome it anyway. When you do what's needed, no matter how difficult or dangerous. There was something about those words I liked. So be brave now, Liv. The bravest you ever been, he whispered. I didn't want to let go, but I knew I had to. I had to be brave, for Grandpa, and for myself. The children stood in silence. They weren't threatening, but instead seemed as puzzled and frightened by the situation as I was. A small red-haired girl stepped forward into the middle of the circle. Welcome, Liv, she said, looking straight at me. I didn't understand how she knew my name, but I still managed a quiet, thank you. The redhead smiled quickly. Good, now everyone's here, she said. I was struck by the fact that she suddenly sounded so grown up, almost formal. Put in your mouth guards and bite down hard. The children started looking on their pockets, and I did the same. To my surprise, there was something there that I hadn't noticed before. Something made from plastic. It looked like one of those mouth guards that boxers use. Boxers. I didn't even know what a boxer was. An unpleasant feeling that I was no longer in control of my own thoughts took hold of me. The other children also looked bewildered, as if they felt exactly the same way. Bite, said the redhead. We listened to the instructions, took out our mouth guards, put the mouth guard in our mouths and bit down. Shut your eyes, she said. I looked at Grandpa, who nodded encouragingly at me before closing my eyes. Then she said, the reboot has begun. I barely understood the last part, because right then, an electric shock shot through my temples, blinding white with pain. I felt like I was being broken up, like all my memories were being fragmented, thrown around and replaced by new ones. Suddenly, I was in someone else's head, someone I already knew well, showing me their life story in images and emotions, at 1,000 times the speed and not in order. Vague sensations of the greatest love and the deepest sorrow swept by without being able to seize them. And then everything calmed down. I opened my eyes with a start and gasped for breath. The room I was in was stark white with bright LED lights in the ceiling. I was lying on some kind of hard examination table, far from the cozy sofa bed at home in the kitchen. It was as if my body and my thoughts had separated, as if I no longer weighed anything, but was floating in the air, like some kind of mist. Then I realized that my lifeless body was connected by wires to a big whirring machine. A red-haired woman in a white coat stood at the foot of the bed. She's on her way back, the woman said. But I didn't understand who was coming back and from where. Breathe deeply. You're about to land, the redhead said. And that was actually how I felt. My thoughts slowly began to be part of a physical body again. I made contact with my fingers and could feel my arms. It was an unpleasant feeling, like when your leg falls asleep and you try to get up. When I looked at my hands, I got a shock. The hands were adult hands. The fingernails had bright nail polish on them. There was a gold ring on the ring finger. My panic intensified. But the redhead smiled reassuringly, and she suddenly felt familiar. I realized that I knew her. Welcome back, Liv, she said. Thanks, Emma. I heard myself reply in an adult voice I didn't recognize. You've been away for exactly 12 hours. 1 hour per year. The technology worked perfectly. Your vitals are fine. The redhead, who was apparently called Emma, gave me a glass of sweet liquid. You're showing some signs of confusion, but that's normal after a reboot. Drink this and you'll soon be back. I drank the liquid greedily, and the last cloud in my head already disappeared with the first sips. Emma took my pulse and looked satisfied. You remember what to do now, don't you? And yes, I did indeed remember. I'm going to the debriefing as soon as possible, I replied in that ridiculous adult voice. Emma smiled and nodded. Good, it's important that we bring everyone together right away, before reality contaminates our experience. Are you ready? That's what I signed up for, so what choice do I have? I heard myself say. I sat up in bed and vomited straight up to the floor. Emma looked at me with a sympathetic gaze. Motion sickness. It's not uncommon. We'll take care of it while you go to the meeting. A young guard in uniform escorted me in silence through the white corridor with excessively bright lights. I remember that my name was Liv, but I was frantically trying to figure out who I was and where I was going. I didn't recognize the place, but to my surprise, I was finding my way. We reached a lift, and according to the display, we were apparently on floor 68. When the doors opened, there were already 2 people in the lift. a female guard who escorted a man with a confused look in his face. We nodded politely at each other. I had never seen him before, but he was still familiar somehow. When the lift started to move upwards, I realized that the far wall was entirely made of glass. I saw a night-lit city stretching all the way to the horizon. At first, I was relieved. This was the same dead city I had just walked through, but now it was alive again. I was struck by a chilling thought. I looked at my newfound friend. "Where are all the trees?" I managed to ask. But he just shook his head quizzically. That's when I saw that he was upset. Before I could ask him how he was feeling, he started speaking English with a rather heavy accent. I was little again. I had a grandfather. We cultivated the land. We went fishing, like people did before. But then there was a flash flood. Everything got submerged. Everything. We were forced to live on boats. My country was gone. It disappeared into the sea, he said before his voice broke. I put my hand on his and tried to find the words. But the silence would have to be comfort enough. He was just as stricken as I was. We shared our experience, even though his was obviously quite different from mine. The silence was interrupted by a lift voice saying, "Top floor." She sounded just like a flight attendant, I thought. But I didn't know how I knew what one sounded like. We wandered down a corridor clad in black marble and came to a large double door. My guard opened the door and I stood for a second, bewildered. Then he smiled reassuringly and waved his hand to signal that it was time for us to enter. The room inside was bigger than I had expected. There was a huge table in the middle. National flags and oil portraits of important men and women lined the walls. The far wall was entirely made of glass, and the city outside formed a glimmering backdrop that took your breath away. But most striking were all the children sitting in silence around the big table. The children from the square. Only they were adults now, just like me. There were name plaques with little flags in front of them. They came from all four corners of the world. A door opened at the far end of the room. A little murmur of recognition went through the room. When I saw him, my heart skipped a beat. Grandpa. But it wasn't him. He looked much younger. That wasn't Grandpa. But his warm gaze was the same. Then he spoke. "Welcome back, and congratulations. You have just completed the first step in Project Ragna." All the adult children around the table looked at each other in confusion. The man continued. "As you know, Ragna means to conjure up. That is, to create, in Old Norse. And that's exactly what Ragna does. Creates possible future scenarios, individually tailored to the recipient, with the aim of conjuring up maximum impact. Thanks to Ragna's high-tech neurological simulation, through your avatars, you have just relived your first 12 years, at some point in the future. Everything he said sounded so familiar, but it was still new to me. You all know the project objective, don't you? The question was aimed at everyone, but no one answered. Right then I made eye contact with Grandpa, who was obviously someone else. He was my age. I interrupted my own thoughts. That has to be Grandpa standing there, right? He saw my confusion and smiled at me. I understand. There's a lot to take in and you haven't completely landed yet. Let me remind you of the objective. The future of humanity is under threat. All our efforts have been in vain. It's quite clear that boring forecasts, formal calculations, and rigid processes won't save us. There simply isn't enough time. That's why we created Ragna, a hyper-realistic simulation of the future based on all the known climate data we have today. Look around in the room. We looked at each other. I couldn't remember any of their names, but they were familiar faces. Some famous people, some vague acquaintances, even some close friends. The man who wasn't Grandpa continued. The combined power around this table, with the top politicians, policymakers, opinion leaders and business leaders, can achieve the change that is needed. That's why you funded this project. You want to help, but you needed to know how. When he said the last part, there was an outburst of emotion in the room. We didn't get any answers. What exactly do we need to do? He raised his steadying hand and everyone fell silent. I understand that you didn't get a simple solution you had hoped for, because unfortunately they don't exist. But you have all, in different ways, been given the elements you need to move forward. With Ragna's help, you were able to live a life that people today have lost touch with. You were able to reconnect to an unspoiled world, surrounded by safe and functioning ecosystem. You also got to experience a terrible, lifeless future that we know is coming if we do nothing. Ragna's objective is not to return humanity to a primitive life in the forest. The objective is to remind people of what has been lost, how fragile the planet is, and what's at stake for humanity. This isn't something you can read about. You have to experience it. No one in here knows exactly how we are going to succeed at this precise moment. But now you know it has to be done. Use that feeling to drive your work. The room fell silent. It was clear that we had all experienced things that had changed us fundamentally. We met each other's eyes, and it was as if we all suddenly understood. Ragna's chief operating officer, who I had thought was my grandpa throughout my imaginary 12-year life, looked at me. I would like to start by handing over to you, Prime Minister. Everyone's eyes turned to me. I gathered my thoughts, then I stood up and spoke. We can't solve this, but only if we are prepared to make great sacrifices. Only if we are brave, braver than we have ever been. And only if we do it together, one day at a time, I heard myself say, with complete conviction in my voice. The man, who was not Grandpa, looked at me with the same warm gaze as when we lived in the untouched forest. That's exactly right, Liv. One day at a time. And the moment he said it, I knew we were going to figure this out.
Author, Henrik Björn. Director, Henrik Björn, Lina Svanberg. Audio engineer, Daniel Högberg. Sound design and mix, Jonas Mats Jansson, Jakob Ödman. Composer, Jonas Mats Jansson, Anders Nygårds. Research, Andrew Mary, Head of Futures at Planifon. Product leader and producer, Munk Studios, Stina Tyrell Samgård. Executive producer, Spotify, Karin Bäckmark and Peter Nyrén. 2072 is produced by Munk Studios for Spotify.
Keep it clean, show me that you care. Wherever there's a world to see.